Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. My name is Thomas, and what I am going to tell you happened about 4 or 5 years ago. But the memory remains so clear that it seems like it was yesterday. At that time, I had a small carpentry shop in the back of a warehouse, in one of those areas that are on the city limits, where the asphalt ends and life seems to slow down. Every single day, at the end of the workday, I made the same walk home, about 20 minutes walking on a dirt road, on one side the long fence of a trucking company, on the other a few houses very far apart from each other, with that air of a place that time forgot. And right in the middle of that route, there was a construction that always caught my attention. It was a house that was never finished, you know. It was only an exposed brick, already darkened by moisture. Weeds had taken over the lot, and the metal gate, low and eaten by rust, was always slightly open. It had all the appearance of abandonment. It was a Tuesday, if I am not mistaken. I was coming tired, my head still buzzing with the noise of the machines, just thinking about getting home soon. When I passed in front of that house, I saw something different. Leaning against the gate from the inside were a boy and a girl. They must have been at most about 7 or 8 years old. I kept walking, but I watched them. They were completely still, just following me with their eyes. Their clothes were simple, somewhat faded, and both had a paleness that did not seem normal, not even for the weak light of dusk. It seemed strange to me. Of course, the place was a ruin full of dangers. I immediately thought of their parents. What kind of people leave 2 small children alone in a place like that? For a second I thought about saying something to them, but what was I going to say? I was exhausted, and one learns not to get involved where they are not called. I continued on my way, but the image of them stayed hammering in my head. The stillness, above all. Children do not stay still like that. The next day, the same thing. I swear I tried not to think about it during work. I kept busy with a complicated wardrobe that a client had ordered, but there was no way. As the time to leave approached, a strange anxiety began to grow. I found myself hoping they would not be there, but there they were in the same place with the same posture. It looked like a photograph from the previous day. This time I could not just keep walking. My conscience really weighed on me. What if those children were hungry? What if they were trapped there somehow? I could no longer pretend it was not my business. I took a deep breath and diverted my path, crossing the dirt path to the rusty gate. The smell of mold and wet earth became stronger. "Hey there, kids," I said, forcing a friendly tone. "Here again." The 2 just looked at me without changing expression. It was the girl, Alice, who responded with a low little voice. "Our parents don't let us go out to play." That gave me a bad feeling, not because of the phrase itself, but because of the way she said it. It sounded like something memorized, a prepared response. I looked over the gate toward the ruined house. There was no door, just the dark hole of the frame. No window had glass. It made no sense at all. "Are your parents in there?" I asked, and the boy, Carl, nodded slowly with his head. "Do you think I could talk to them for a minute?" He shrugged. I felt like a complete idiot, but I called anyway, resting my hand on the gate. "Hello, excuse me, may I?" Only the sound of wind passing through the holes in the bricks answered me. I insisted once more, a little louder. Nothing, a heavy silence of a dead place. I looked at the children again. Both their eyes were fixed on me with an expectation that made me feel very uncomfortable. Look, I started without knowing exactly what to do. Tomorrow I will come back. I pass by here again, and I will try to talk to them. How does that sound? I promise I will try to convince your parents to let you take a walk. For the first time I saw a reaction. A tiny smile, almost imperceptible, appeared on both their faces at the same time. Without saying more, they turned around and ran toward the darkness of the house, disappearing from my sight. I stood there for a moment and felt a strange chill throughout my body. There was something very wrong about that place. That night I barely slept. I tossed and turned in bed, and the image of their smile, identical, would not leave my head. It was not a smile of joy. There was something victorious about it, something planned. The next day in the workshop, I made mistakes cutting 2 pieces of wood, something that had not happened to me in years. My mind was elsewhere. It was on the dirt road, at the rusty gate. The promise I made weighed on me like a debt. When evening came, I no longer felt the same anxiety as the day before. It was something else. It was a kind of determination. I needed to understand that. As I approached the house, my heart beat a little faster. I looked toward the gate and nobody was there. It was empty. For a second I felt immense relief, but it lasted little and was soon replaced by a stab of disappointment. It was as if deep down I was expecting them. Even so, I went there. I pushed the gate that made a horrible noise of metal scraping and took a step inside the lot, keeping my other foot on the road. The smell of humidity and rotting things was even stronger there. It was then that I really looked at the house, not like someone passing by on the street, but like someone inspecting. The walls had cracks so big I could stick my hand in some of them. The roof in one part of the back had completely collapsed. You could see the sky through the hole. The floor inside was covered with debris, dry leaves, and pieces of tile. It was impossible, simply impossible for anyone to live there. It was not a poor house. It was a ruin about to collapse. Nobody in their right mind would raise their children in a place like that. My brain was spinning trying to find a logic that did not exist. Maybe they came from another house, but there was no other one close enough. My gaze swept the ground toward the exact place where they used to be. The earth was soft, dark, and that is when I saw it. There was something shining a little, almost completely buried. I crouched down, feeling my knee crack. With my fingertips, I dug in the dirt and pulled out the object. It was one of those old marbles, made of milky glass, with some color spirals inside. It was dirty and had a crack that went from one side to the other, but there was no doubt. It was a child's toy. I squeezed that marble in the palm of my hand. It was cold and solid, real. That was the proof. The proof that they were real, that I was not going crazy. Someone had been there. I felt a different kind of chill. It was not just strangeness. It was the sensation of getting into something I should not. Without thinking much, I cleaned the marble on my pants and put it in my pocket. It seemed to weigh a ton. I knew I was not going to have peace until I discovered the truth behind that house. I got home that day with my head in a mess. My wife, Celeste, was in the kitchen, and the smell of a stew on the stove, something so normal, seemed from another world, one that no longer had anything to do with mine. I washed my hands, sat at the table and stayed quiet, turning the marble in my pants pocket. I could no longer keep that to myself. "Celeste," I started, and my voice came out lower than I intended. She turned from the stove, drying her hand on a kitchen towel. "Can I ask you something kind of weird?" She looked at me, noticing my tone. "Of course. What is wrong? You look like you have seen a ghost." I swallowed. "That abandoned house on the dirt road, the one that is falling apart. Do you know any story about that place?" Celeste frowned, thinking. "That one that is all destroyed. No, why? It is just that I saw some things there." I hesitated, feeling like a fool. "In the last few days, I saw 2 children at the gate, a boy and a girl." She stopped what she was doing and looked at me with concern. "Children, Thomas. Nobody has lived there for ages. Are you not working too much? Getting tired?" "I know it sounds crazy," I insisted, leaning forward, "but I saw them. I even talked to them. And the house, Celeste, today I looked at it closely. It is impossible for anyone to live there. The roof fell down. Everything is debris." She remained silent for a good while, with her eyes lost at a point on the wall. Her expression changed. She seemed to be making an effort to remember something. "Wait, abandoned house, children," she spoke slowly. "I think my aunt once told me a story about that place, a long, long time ago." My heart accelerated. "What story?" "It is a sad story. She said that years ago a couple lived there. They were not from town. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl." Celeste looked at me with her voice now more serious. "But the children died, both of them." I felt like the air was missing from my lungs. "They died how?" "Nobody knows for sure. The story that went around at the time was of an ugly accident inside the house. Negligence by the parents, you know, a tragedy that was silenced. After that, the couple could not stand it. They say they went crazy with grief and guilt. They abandoned the house with everything inside one night and simply disappeared from town. Nobody ever knew about them again." While Celeste spoke, each word seemed like a hammer hitting my head. The couple, the children, the abandonment, the house. I instinctively put my hand in my pocket, and my fingers closed around the cold marble. The children's paleness, the simple clothes, the memorized response, the strange smile. Everything made horrible sense. I was not helping 2 children, I was talking to ghosts. The next day I did not want to go to work. I considered calling the workshop, saying I was sick. The idea of making that same walk at dusk made me nauseous, but I went. All day, the conversation with Celeste echoed in my mind. With each piece of wood I cut, I saw the pale eyes of those children. The marble remained in my pocket, freezing, like a constant reminder. The return was the worst part. Each step on the dirt road seemed heavy, calculated. The sun was already low, painting the sky with those strange colors of dusk, a strong orange mixed with purple. My eyes were fixed on the point of the road where the house would appear. My whole body was tense, prepared to see them at the gate. But when I passed in front, there was nobody. The house was silent, quiet, rotting there. I felt a relief so intense that my legs went weak. I quickened my pace, almost running, wanting to leave that place behind as quickly as possible. I was already about 200 meters from the house, starting to breathe normally, when I passed in front of the old town cemetery. A place surrounded by a low fence with an iron gate always closed, but through which you could see everything inside. It was a quiet, sad place that I normally ignored. But that day, something moved inside, an agitation that caught my attention, out of the corner of my eye. I stopped. My instinct screamed at me to keep going, not to look, but it was like a magnet. I had to look. And I saw them. Carl and Alice were there among the graves, but they were not still and sad. They were playing. They ran after each other at a speed that was not natural, zigzagging between the stone crosses and old tombstones. Their movements were erratic, too fast, and the most terrifying thing was the silence. Their feet made no noise on the dry grass. Their laughter had no sound. It was like watching an old, accelerated movie without audio, a macabre and silent scene. I stood there outside the gate, completely paralyzed. I felt my whole body lock up. It was the final confirmation, the truth right in front of me. Everything Celeste said, all the strangeness I felt, everything made terrible sense now. Then, in the middle of that silent race, they stopped. Suddenly, both of them, at the same instant, as if they had heard an order I could not hear, stood motionless for a second, and then, very slowly, turned in my direction. Both at the same time. Their eyes pierced through the cemetery's twilight and fixed on mine, as if they knew I had been there all along. There was no longer sadness in their faces. There was recognition, a kind of cold satisfaction. And then what happened sealed my terror forever. The girl, Alice, slowly raised her arm on purpose and stretched out her index finger. She pointed directly at me. It was not a greeting, it was more than that. It was an accusation, an invitation, a sentence. At that instant the paralysis broke. I did not scream, I made no noise. I simply turned around and ran. I ran like I had never run in my life, with the air burning my lungs and my heart beating in my throat. I did not look back once. I got home breathless, stumbling over my own feet. I opened the door so hard it hit the wall, and Celeste jumped in fright from the living room. When she saw me pale, sweating cold and with bulging eyes, her fright turned to panic. She ran to me, holding me, asking what had happened. I could only babble things without sense. The cemetery, they were there, she pointed at me. I did not need to explain much. The panic on my face said it all. That night we locked all the doors and windows. Celeste, who has always been more religious, lit some candles and started praying. I tried to follow her, but my words would not come out. I could only see that stretched finger pointing at me. At some point, in the middle of the night, I remembered the marble in my pocket. With disgust, I took it, opened the kitchen window, and threw it as hard as I could into the weeds on the other side of the street. I needed to get rid of that. I never took that road again. The next day, I quit the workshop. I got another job in a completely different place that I go to by bus. My acquaintances thought I was crazy for leaving my own business, but I did not care. No money in the world would pay for having to pass by that road again. Sometimes I think about all this. I think about my insistence. I could have continued on my way the first day. I could have understood that it was not my business, but I did not. I was moved by pity, a sense of justice that in the end turned out to be the biggest stupidity of my life. Today I understand what happened. They did not want help. They did not want prayers. They did not want peace. They were alone, trapped in endless boredom, and the only thing they wanted was someone new to play with. And I, in my naivety, volunteered. My curiosity was an invitation. That pointing finger was not a death threat. It was something worse. It was confirmation that I had been chosen. And although I ran away, although I never went back there, a part of me feels that the game is not over. Sometimes when the house is silent, I clearly feel that I am being watched by childish eyes, and I know that certain doors, once opened, never close properly again. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. My name is Laura, and I'm a nursing student in my early 20s. I usually don't share everything that happens to me, but there's something buried deep in my chest that won't let me sleep. I need to tell this story, even though I'm still not sure if what I witnessed was bad luck, something paranormal, or pure madness. It all started on a Tuesday evening during spring break when Clayton, my lifelong friend and rideshare driver who worked routes between counties, called me with a trembling voice. He was driving home from Dallas, taking the state highway that cuts through the cotton fields of East Texas. Clayton was one of those good guys who would stop to change a stranger's flat tire. That day, the app had given him decent earnings, and he just wanted to get home, have dinner with his fiancée, and sleep. The problem arose when an accident blocked the main road, and he decided to take the detour through the infamous stretch of Highway 52. A narrow, pothole-filled road with no street lights. Halfway down the route, well into the night, he saw a sandy-colored bundle on the ground, right after a makeshift speed bump. It didn't look big, but it was moving. "Laura, do you think I should pull over?" he asked through the speaker. "It could be an injured animal." "Look carefully," I replied, half suspicious. "If it's a dog, move it to the shoulder and keep going. Don't get out for too long." He stopped, turned on his high beams, and discovered a baby wrapped in a green wool blanket. Its breathing was short, almost a whisper. "If I take it to the hospital, is that kidnapping?" Clayton hesitated. "Just take it straight to the emergency room and file a report. Please do it." He placed the baby in the passenger seat, activated his hazard lights, and started moving at a snail's pace toward the next community. The small town of Cedar Creek was already dark, not a single window lit. At a second speed bump, a hunched woman appeared, skin wrinkled like dry leather. She approached the glass and pointed at the baby, without saying a word. "Do you know the family?" he asked, rolling down the window barely 2 inches. Silence, just the finger pointing, insistent, slightly trembling. The atmosphere soured immediately, and he drove off. "Laura, this creepy old lady came out and hit the car. She just kept pointing at the blanket," he reported, accelerating. "I'm going straight to the regional hospital." "Don't stop again. Call the police as soon as you get there." When he arrived at the nearest big city, he parked at the emergency room entrance. I stayed on the line and heard everything. The nurse took the baby and disappeared down the hallway. 2 police officers asked for documents and started taking notes. "Sir, how long have you had the child?" asked the attending physician. "Less than an hour. I found it alive on the highway," Clayton assured him. "The baby you brought in hasn't been breathing for at least a week," the doctor stated dryly. I heard a thud. Clayton had fainted. When he came to, he was handcuffed to the gurney. "Routine procedure," they said. They ordered me to go to the hospital as his emergency contact. I got a ride with his fiancée Denise, who was 6 months pregnant. The trip was silent, except for the static of the out-of-tune radio. At the adjacent police station, they released Clayton after his statement. He came out pale, holding his head, swearing that the baby had been moving in the seat. We returned in a single truck. Just before the bridge over a nameless creek, he asked us to stop the vehicle. He ran out and vomited a dark, viscous foam that smelled like rust. Denise panicked and suggested we visit Don Mauricio, a famous healer at a nearby ranch. We arrived almost at dawn. He let only Clayton and Denise's belly inside. I stayed outside, praying quietly. After a while, he came out calm, almost light, saying that the Lord had removed what wasn't his. It seemed strange to me, but I nodded. The following weeks were a roller coaster. Days of complete normalcy, laughter and plans for their baby, and nights when Clayton would call me crying, saying he heard the distant cry of a newborn inside his own walls. One Sunday at dawn, I found him in the yard trying to pull out his fingernails with his teeth. I helped him, bandaged him, and promised to return to the hospital. The psychiatrist spoke of acute stress. The neurologist ordered tests, but nothing appeared. Clayton swore he saw the highway woman reflected in his rearview mirror even when the car was stopped. His parents started avoiding going out after nightfall. 3 months later, on a cloudy Monday, Clayton disappeared. The truck was found abandoned on the same stretch of highway. The passenger door was open, the green blanket damp with dew, thrown on the asphalt. No trace of him. Searches with dogs, drones, nothing. No footprints, no clothes. Just a smell of sour milk floating in the air. 2 days later, I received a manila envelope with no return address. Inside was an old pacifier full of bite marks and a USB drive. I connected it first. A soft baby's cry was heard, then the hoarse voice of the old woman, "You're missing." Since then, I sleep with the light on. Denise moved away and had the baby girl, but she doesn't let anyone call her by the name Clayton had chosen. I still sometimes drive down that highway, trying to understand where he ended up. Telling this story here is my way of warning you. If you see something defenseless lying on the deserted asphalt, think twice before stopping. Not every good deed ends in gratitude. Sometimes the road takes more than it gives, and some debts are paid in ways we never imagined. The old woman's voice still echoes in my mind sometimes, especially on quiet nights when the wind carries sounds from places that shouldn't exist. I've learned that Highway 52 holds secrets that are better left undisturbed. Clayton learned that lesson too late, and now he's part of whatever darkness lurks on that stretch of road. If you ever find yourself driving through East Texas and see that familiar green blanket on the asphalt, keep driving. Some things that appear to need saving are actually the ones doing the hunting. And once they've marked you, once they've tasted your kindness, they'll follow you home and collect what they believe you owe them. The baby on Highway 52 wasn't looking for rescue. It was looking for a replacement. And somewhere in the cotton fields of East Texas, Clayton learned that the hard way. My name is Olivia. I'm in my 30s, and I need to get this story out before I start doubting everything myself. When I moved to the 22nd floor of the Marina Blue building, I thought I had finally escaped the dust of the housing project where I grew up. The apartment had floor-to-ceiling windows and a permanent smell of fresh paint, something I had only experienced in luxury stores. Robert, my husband, said the air was lighter there. Actually, it was more expensive. Our son Benjamin was born shortly after the move, a quiet baby who slept rocked by the distant rumble of the waves. I spent afternoons arranging his room, trying to forget the damp walls I had also known in my childhood. The first week, I noticed a sharp noise on the glass balcony, as if something had gently hit it. It was sunset when I approached and saw a barn owl perched on the railing, wings spread as if testing the breeze. The orange light of dusk made the bird almost transparent, but the dark outline around its eyes looked like a hole staring back at me. I stood motionless, holding the baby bottle. The owl didn't blink or move until Robert arrived and slammed the door shut. With the noise, it took flight in a silence that chilled me, leaving only whitish stains on the glass. Robert laughed, said it was a high-rise thing, being close to the hillside, and returned to his meeting with the headset on. That night I kept replaying the scene while Benjamin breathed beside me, and I convinced myself it had just been a silly scare. 2 days later, I found another stain on the windowsill, but no bird. I cleaned compulsively, as if I could erase a message I didn't understand. When I turned on the security camera pointing at the balcony, it only captured brief shadows crossing the frame at 3 in the morning. I showed the recording to Robert. He shrugged, said it could be a large moth, and returned to his laptop. That's when I decided to seek help, where I thought I'd never return, in the old housing project, where neighbors still hang red ribbons on doors against pigeons and the evil eye. Tanya, a childhood friend, became a healer after losing her cashier job. No one better to listen to something that seems like madness. I drove there one cloudy Saturday, Benjamin sleeping in the car carrier, while I stopped at every traffic light, remembering the smell of fried food from my adolescence. Tanya received me in a townhouse with a rusty gate. Her face had new lines, but the smile was the same. I told her about the owl, about the strange silence. She listened with her head down, drawing circles with her finger on the table. Envious people send flying things because they don't want to show their faces, she said, without looking up. She went out to get a rue branch, tied a red ribbon, and adjusted it to my wrist like putting on a watch. I explained that I couldn't hang a plant on the door of a luxury building without it looking like tacky decoration. She laughed and said that envy doesn't read decoration manuals. I promised to return, but I left there thinking I'd never have the courage to display hanging herbs on the Marina Blues lock. On the way back, drizzle covered the windshield. For an instant, I had the impression of seeing the silhouette of an owl following the car along the highway cables. That night, Benjamin woke up crying with a fever. I asked Robert to get the thermometer. He grumbled about the hour and talked about daycare viruses we weren't even attending yet. I sat on the sofa with the child in my arms when I heard a crack on the terrace, like glass breaking. The curtain moved, even though all the windows had been closed since early. I went there with Benjamin pressed against my chest. Nothing but humid wind and the neighbor building's light flickering. But on the floor, among the potted plants, I found a long cream-colored feather stained with rust. I spent the dawn on the sofa, the television on without sound, more for the glow than for the news. In the morning, I called Tanya. She asked me to come back in the afternoon, said she needed to show me something. I made up an appointment for Robert and drove back to the housing project. Benjamin was feverish in the back seat. When I arrived, the street was having a block party, grilled meat, music at full volume, children running with balloons. Tanya called me to the patio. She had set aside a dark corner with a burgundy tablecloth over a box. In the center, a jar with dark water reflected the cloudy sky. Next to it, 3 photos of ours from school days, held by thick thread. "Someone near you twisted the line," she said, pointing to the tangled thread. "I need to contain what they're saying before it becomes illness." That sounded exaggerated, but Benjamin's fever burned in my arm. I let her pour a little mezcal into the water and pray in a low voice. Suddenly, my phone rang. It was Robert, upset because the realtor needed an immediate signature on a contract. The rush won out. I took the child, thanked her quickly, and promised to call later. I returned through the crowded avenues, repeating to myself that everything would be solved with acetaminophen and rest. In the building's elevator, I noticed that the wrist with the ribbon was itching. The fabric seemed to tighten more than necessary. At 7 p.m., Robert left for the office, saying he'd be back around midnight. I was alone with the baby and library silence. Before going to bed, I checked the camera. I recorded 20 seconds of an empty balcony, but there was a clear dot floating in the air that I couldn't explain. I deleted the video, trying to convince myself I saw nothing. At 3 o'clock, Benjamin cried, and I woke up with a tight chest. I walked to his room in the dark. The door was ajar. I pushed it with my foot and felt the awning window vibrating despite being a windless night. When I turned on the lamp, I saw the empty crib and the window glass open a palm's width. I ran down the hallway, heart racing, calling Robert even though I knew he wasn't home. I found the baby sitting on the living room carpet, head bent with sleep, surrounded by light feathers like dirty snow. I took him in my arms, checked his fever, almost normal, as if nothing had happened. I spent the rest of the dawn sitting, staring at the terrace, my arm tired from holding my son. The next day, the condo administrator called saying neighbors complained about animal noise at dawn. Noise I couldn't explain either. When Robert arrived, I told him every detail. He suggested a psychologist, said guilt over motherhood disorders the nerves. I swallowed the offense, but didn't argue. I just asked him to install a new lock on Benjamin's window. On the eve of the child's 6-month birthday, an unexpected visitor knocked on the door. Tanya, her face dejected, eyes full of tears. "Sorry to arrive without notice, but I had to come," she whispered. "The thread I tied broke by itself this morning." She entered looking at every corner as if expecting something to jump from the wall. In the hallway, she stopped in front of the long mirror and touched the glass with 2 fingers, as if measuring the temperature. I stood without knowing what to say. Benjamin, in my arms, started laughing at his reflection. That's when the mirror fogged up from the inside, as if breathing behind the surface. Tanya stepped back, murmuring a prayer. I froze, unable to ask the obvious. The fog disappeared as quickly as it arrived. And there, for a second, I was sure I saw the silhouette of a woman all dressed in white behind us. Tanya left hurriedly, promising to return with help. Robert arrived shortly after, without hearing a single word about the mirror. At dawn on Saturday, I woke up to a metallic sound like a low screech. I followed to the living room where the balcony curtain was swaying. I opened the sliding door, ready to fight with the wind, and encountered the owl on the railing. I felt like it was waiting for me. The distance between us was less than a meter, but I couldn't touch it. The animal kept its wings half raised, as if deciding whether to stay or fly. "What do you want?" I asked in a ridiculous whisper, more for me than for the bird. It turned its head without haste, black eyes shining. In that movement, I saw in the background, on the street far below, a woman standing still, light dress pressed against her body by the dew. I blinked, and the woman disappeared among the trees. The owl flapped its wings and vanished into the night without sound. I went back inside. The baby was still sleeping. I sat on the hallway floor until dawn broke. I asked Robert for us to leave for a few days. He accepted, but work always postponed the trip for the next week. Between one postponement and another, the kitchen lights exploded by themselves. The intercom rang with no one answering. I walked through the building hallways afraid of mirrors, afraid of windows, afraid even of the thick carpet that muffled steps I couldn't see. One Tuesday morning, the building manager showed me parking garage images. At 2:07 a.m., a clear figure walked next to my car, but the motion sensor didn't turn on any lights. Robert laughed when he heard it, said it was a reflection of headlights from the avenue, a cheap camera trick. I no longer argued. Each denial of his only made me more determined to seek help outside. Tanya set an appointment in an abandoned warehouse near the port. She said we could pray there without being interrupted by curious people. I arrived at sunset, the smell of salt mixed with rust. The place was enormous, full of old boxes and seagull noise. Tanya had arranged candles on a wooden spool. She put Benjamin's photo in the center and started walking in circles, praying in a low voice. I held the baby, who was sleeping deeply, when a current of air entered through the rusty door. The candles flickered. One flame went out, filling the air with sweet smoke. In the dark, I heard the sound of heels echoing on the concrete. I turned and saw the woman in the light dress, face covered by a damp veil, standing a few meters away. She didn't speak, didn't move, just tilted her head as if regretting something. Tanya grabbed my arm, ordering me not to respond, but the woman was already walking away, sliding toward the water that hit the dock. When she reached the big door, she disappeared without sound, as if she had become part of the fog rising from the sea. We returned to the car in silence. Benjamin woke up without crying, staring at the ceiling. On the way home, Tanya said that wasn't the work of her or some envious person. There was something older there, something that took shape because I wanted to erase my past. I arrived at the building almost at dawn, exhausted but curiously calm, as if the worst part had stayed at the port. In the following days, the owl didn't return. The mirror remained clean. Benjamin slept through entire nights without fever. Robert concluded that the strange phase had passed. I didn't respond, just asked that we not sell the apartment for now. Sometimes when I'm alone in the living room, I remember the woman on the street, the veil soaked with dew, and I feel a slight chill. Nothing serious, like putting your hand in cold water. I kept the stained feather inside a hardcover book. Sometimes the page opens by itself to that part, and then I close it without looking much. I never spoke to Tanya again, though I know the way to the housing project and the rusty gate. Maybe I'll go back someday, but not now. For now, I prefer the silence of the 22nd floor, even knowing that too much silence amplifies steps that no one is taking. I only tell this story to say that if you encounter an almost transparent owl in the middle of the city, think twice before scaring it away. It might not be the one invading your life. Sometimes we're the ones who bring something hanging from our own shadow, and the animal just came to warn us that the past never truly lets go. It just changes shape and learns to fly. My name is Detective Marcus Thompson, and I'm writing this because I need someone to know what really happened in that basement. What I'm about to tell you will sound like the ravings of a madman, but I swear on my mother's grave that every word is true. I've been a cop for 13 years, seen the worst this city has to offer, but nothing prepared me for what I discovered in the winter of 2008. It started with a cassette tape that appeared on my desk one morning. No return address, no signature, just a handwritten note that said, "If you don't believe what you hear, go to the basement." They sealed it, but he's still there. The tape was labeled Reeves 84 in faded ink. I should have thrown it away, should have filed it under weird crank mail. But something about it made my skin crawl. That night, sitting in my car in the precinct parking lot, I played the tape on an old Walkman I kept in my glove compartment. The voice that came through the speakers was rough, broken, like someone who'd been screaming for hours. It belonged to Commander Frank Reeves, a name that still made veteran cops cross themselves when they heard it. The recording started with the sound of heavy breathing, then Reeves' voice, shaky and desperate. "My name is Commander Frank Reeves, badge number 7489. If anyone finds this, you need to know what happened down there. What we unleashed, what's still waiting. Before I tell you what was on that tape, you need to understand who Frank Reeves was. In the early 80s, he was a legend in the Detroit Police Department, but not the kind you'd want to meet in a dark alley. He was dirty, brutal, and completely untouchable. Word was he'd killed more people than the winter of '78, and that was just the ones they knew about. His interrogation methods were the stuff of nightmares, and his word carried more weight than a judge's gavel. The basement he talked about was real. I'd heard whispers about it over the years, an off-the-books interrogation site beneath the old 8th Precinct building. Officially, it didn't exist. Unofficially, it was where suspects went to confess or disappear. The building had been converted into a federal records storage facility in the 90s, and most people had forgotten what used to happen in its depths. But Reeves remembered. His voice on that tape was haunted, desperate, like a man confessing his sins to an empty church. He told me about the night that changed everything, the night he met something that shouldn't exist. It was July 15th, 1984. His voice crackled through the speakers. Hotter than hell, even at midnight. We'd picked up this punk, Vincent Carrera, small-time dealer working for the Torino family. Should have been routine, you know. Rough him up, get him to flip on his suppliers, maybe plant some evidence if he didn't cooperate. That's how we did business back then. I could hear him lighting a cigarette, the flame hissing in the background. But something was off about Carrera from the minute we grabbed him. He didn't fight, didn't cry, didn't even ask for a lawyer. Just sat there in the back of the cruiser, smiling like he knew something we didn't. And when we dragged him down to the basement, he looked around like he was coming home. The basement Reeves described was a nightmare of cracked concrete and exposed pipes, the kind of place where screams echoed off the walls and blood seeped into the foundation. The air was thick with the smell of fear and violence, years of it layered like paint on the walls. But according to Reeves, Carrera breathed it in like perfume. We chained him up, standard procedure. Hands above his head, feet barely touching the ground. My partner Rodriguez started with the usual questions, but Carrera just kept smiling. That's when I noticed his eyes. They were black, not just dark brown, but black like looking into a deep well. And he was staring at the wall behind us, like he could see through it. The interrogation went on for hours. They beat him with phone books, shocked him with car batteries, even brought in Rodriguez's German shepherd to scare him. But Carrera never broke. If anything, he seemed to enjoy it, laughing at their efforts like they were performing some elaborate joke. Around 3 a.m, he started talking. Reeves' voice dropped to a whisper. But not about drugs or dealers. He told us about the basement, about what happened there before we started using it. Said it was built on old ground, cursed ground, where the city's founders used to dispose of problems that couldn't be solved with laws or bullets. According to Carrera, the basement wasn't just a place where people disappeared. It was a doorway, a thin spot between worlds where things could slip through if you knew how to call them. The years of violence and suffering had made it stronger, feeding whatever lived in the darkness between the walls. He said we were offerings, Reeves continued, his voice breaking. That everyone who died down there was just bait, drawing something bigger and hungrier closer to our world. And he wasn't a dealer at all. He was a herald, sent to open the door we'd been building with blood and screams. That's when things went wrong. The lights flickered, then died completely, leaving them in absolute darkness. The air grew cold, impossibly cold for a July night in Detroit, and something moved in the shadows, something that shouldn't exist. I heard Rodriguez scream first, Reeves whispered. Not a human scream, but something primal, like his soul was being torn out through his throat. I clicked on my flashlight, and what I saw will haunt me until I die. Rodriguez was suspended in the air, held by something that looked like black smoke with too many arms. His eyes were gone, just empty sockets weeping blood. The thing holding Rodriguez turned toward Reeves, and he saw its face. Or what should have been its face. Instead, there was a void filled with teeth and eyes that weren't quite human. It spoke in Rodriguez's voice, but the words came from somewhere else, somewhere older and hungrier. "Thank you for preparing the way," it said through Rodriguez's mouth. "We've been waiting so long to taste this world again." Reeves ran. He left his partner, his badge, his sanity in that basement, and ran like the devil himself was chasing him. Maybe he was. The other cops found him 3 days later, wandering the streets in his underwear, babbling about shadows and doors and things that fed on suffering. The official report said Rodriguez died in a gas leak explosion that destroyed the basement. There was no mention of Carrera, no record of his arrest, no body in the rubble. It was like he'd never existed at all. Reeves was quietly retired with full pension and a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. But the basement was still there, sealed behind new walls and forgotten paperwork. And according to Reeves' tape, something was still waiting in the darkness. If you're hearing this, his voice was barely audible now, then you're already marked. It knows you're listening. It knows you're curious. And curiosity is how it feeds. The tape ended with a sound I'll never forget: footsteps, wet and heavy, like someone walking barefoot through puddles of blood. Then silence. I should have left it alone, should have filed the tape away and forgotten about it. But I've always been too curious for my own good, and the basement was calling to me like a siren's song. I had to know if Reeves was telling the truth, if there really was something waiting in the darkness beneath the city. The next night, I drove to the old 8th Precinct building. It looked different than I remembered, older somehow, like the years had aged it faster than they should have. The windows were boarded up, and there were more shadows than there should have been, even with the streetlights burning bright. I used my master key to get inside. The building creaked and groaned like a living thing, and every step echoed in the empty hallways. The basement entrance was right where Reeves said it would be, behind a door marked Authorized Personnel Only. But the door wasn't locked. It was just forgotten, covered in dust and spider webs like no one had touched it in decades. The stairs going down were concrete, cracked, and stained with things I didn't want to think about. My flashlight beam danced across the walls, casting shadows that moved when they shouldn't have. And the smell hit me about halfway down old blood, stale urine, and something else. Something sweet and rotten like flowers left too long in a tomb. The basement was exactly as Reeves described it. Concrete walls stained black with years of violence, exposed pipes dripping condensation that looked too thick to be water. File cabinets lined the walls, filled with records of cases that never officially existed. And in the center of the room, carved into the concrete floor, was a symbol that made my eyes water just looking at it. It was a circle filled with spirals and lines that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. At the center was something that might have been an eye, or a mouth, or a doorway to somewhere else entirely. The concrete around it was cracked and scorched, like something had tried to burn its way through from the other side. I pulled out the tape recorder I'd brought and played Reeves' confession again. His voice echoed off the walls, and I could swear I heard other voices joining in, whispers and moans from the darkness beyond my flashlight beam. The temperature dropped until I could see my breath, and frost began forming on the file cabinets. That's when I saw it. In the corner, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure. Tall, impossibly thin, with arms that hung too long and a face that was nothing but darkness. It didn't move, didn't breathe, just watched me with hunger that I could feel in my bones. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The figure stepped forward, and I realized it wasn't walking on the floor but floating just above it, leaving no footprints, but somehow making the concrete crack with each step. When it spoke, its voice was like grinding glass mixed with crying children. "Marcus Thompson," it said, and hearing my name in that voice made my bladder let go. "We've been waiting for you. Frank told us you would come." The walls began to bleed. Not metaphorically, but literally thick, black blood that stank of copper and decay. The blood formed shapes as it flowed, faces twisted in agony, hands reaching out for help that would never come. And all of them were looking at me. "Do you know what this place is?" the thing asked, circling me like a predator. "It's a wound in the world, a place where the membrane between dimensions has been worn thin by decades of suffering. Every scream, every drop of blood, every moment of terror has made it weaker. And now, finally, it's ready to tear completely." I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there like a deer in headlights. But I was frozen, trapped in that moment like a fly in amber. The thing reached out with one impossibly long finger and touched my forehead, and suddenly I could see everything. I saw the basement's history, all of it, playing out like a movie in my mind. I saw the original builders, city officials who needed a place to dispose of problems quietly. I saw the first victims, homeless people and immigrants who wouldn't be missed. I saw years of torture and murder, each death making the wound deeper, the barrier thinner. and I saw what was waiting on the other side. A realm of endless hunger, populated by things that fed on fear and pain and despair. They'd been trying to break through for decades, sending agents like Carrera to prepare the way. All they needed was one more sacrifice, one more death to tear the barrier completely. "You're going to help us," the thing said, and its voice was inside my head now, boring into my brain like a parasite. "You're going to bring us more food, more fear, more beautiful suffering. And in return, we'll let you live long enough to see what happens when the door finally opens." I don't remember how I got out of there. One moment I was standing in that basement, watching reality bleed through the cracks in the walls. And the next I was in my car, driving aimlessly through the empty streets. The sun was rising, painting the sky the color of old blood, and I realized I'd lost an entire night. But I hadn't lost the thing's gift. I could see them now, the shadows that followed people like hungry dogs. They were everywhere, feeding on the darkness in human hearts, growing stronger with every act of cruelty and violence. And they all knew my name. The first few days were the worst. I tried to convince myself it was all a hallucination, stress-induced psychosis brought on by too many years of seeing the worst of humanity. But the shadows wouldn't let me forget. They whispered to me in empty rooms, showed me things that hadn't happened yet, made me understand that I was marked, chosen, infected with something that would never let me go. I started seeing them at crime scenes, riding the backs of killers and rapists like parasites. Some had multiple arms, others had faces made of smoke and screaming mouths. But they all shared one thing: they knew I could see them, and they found it amusing. During a drug bust in the East Side, I watched one of them whisper in a dealer's ear, and suddenly the man's eyes went black as oil. He looked at me and smiled with someone else's face, and I knew it was too late. The infection was spreading, jumping from host to host like a virus made of darkness. "You did this, Marcus," the dealer said in a voice like grinding bone. "You opened the door, you let us in, and now we're going to make this world into something beautiful." I emptied my clip into him, kept pulling the trigger long after he was dead. The other cops said I'd snapped, that I'd confused a surrender for a threat. They gave me mandatory counseling and put me on administrative leave, but I knew what I'd seen. The thing wearing the dealer's face had been laughing, even as the bullets tore through its borrowed flesh. The counseling didn't help. How could it? The psychiatrist couldn't see the shadows crawling across his office ceiling, couldn't hear the whispers coming from inside the walls. He prescribed pills that made everything fuzzy around the edges, but the shadows just adapted, became part of the fog. I tried to fight them at first, covered my apartment in crosses and holy water, drew protective symbols I'd found in old books, even hired a priest to bless the place. But they just laughed at my efforts, moving the crosses when I wasn't looking, making the holy water boil and steam until it evaporated. The worst part was the dreams. Every night I was back in that basement, watching the wound in the world grow wider and wider. I could see through it to the other side, where things that had never been human waited with infinite patience. And every morning, I woke up with dirt under my fingernails and words, carved into my skin, that I didn't remember writing. "Come back," they said, "come home." The breaking point came during a routine traffic stop. I'd pulled over a soccer mom for running a red light, but when she rolled down her window, I saw the shadow sitting in her passenger seat. It had the face of a child, but the eyes were ancient and hungry. and it was whispering things in her ear that made her hands shake on the steering wheel. "Officer," she said, and her voice was perfectly normal, perfectly human. "Is there a problem?" But I could see the truth. The shadow was reaching into her chest, playing with her heart like a puppet master pulling strings. And in the back seat, strapped into car seats, were her children. Real children with real shadows leaning over them, already starting to whisper their poison. I drew my gun and pointed it at the shadow. "Get away from them." The woman's face changed, became something else wearing her skin. "Marcus," she said in that grinding voice I'd heard in the basement, "you can't stop what's already begun. We're in everything now, everyone. The wound is almost healed, and when it is, your world will become ours." I fired 3 times, watching the bullets pass through the shadow without effect. The woman screamed and floored the gas pedal, tires squealing as she fled. Other drivers honked their horns and swerved to avoid her, and I realized they couldn't see what I was seeing. To them, I was just a crazy cop shooting at an innocent mother. That's when I knew I was completely alone. The investigation was swift and thorough. Witnesses said I'd fired at a vehicle without provocation, that I'd been acting erratically for weeks. My partner, Detective Sarah Chen, tried to cover for me, but even she couldn't explain away the fact that I'd opened fire on a minivan full of children. They found the drugs in my system, of course. The antipsychotics and mood stabilizers that were supposed to help me cope with the stress of the job. But they also found other things, chemicals that shouldn't have been there, compounds that the lab technicians couldn't identify. When they asked me about it, I just laughed. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," I said, and that was the truth. The psychiatric evaluation was a formality. The doctor, a tired-looking man named Phillips, had already made up his mind before I walked into his office. He saw the bloodshot eyes, the shaking hands, the way I kept glancing at the corners of the room where the shadows liked to gather. "Marcus," he said, trying to sound compassionate, "you've been under a lot of stress lately. It's understandable that you might be experiencing some perceptual disturbances." I wanted to tell him about the thing crawling across his ceiling, about the way it was tasting the air with a tongue made of smoke and hunger. But I knew he wouldn't believe me. Nobody would. So I played the part they wanted me to play. I nodded in the right places, answered their questions with practiced vulnerability, even shed a few tears when they asked about Rodriguez. Because that's what they expected from a broken cop, someone who'd seen too much and finally snapped. They sent me to Riverside Psychiatric Hospital, a sprawling complex on the outskirts of the city that specialized in treating law enforcement personnel. The building looked like something from a Gothic novel, all towers and shadows and windows that reflected more than they should have. But I knew why they'd really brought me there. The shadows had been whispering about it for weeks, about the old building's history and the experiments that had been conducted in its basement. Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne was my primary psychiatrist, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a gentle manner that almost made me forget about the thing that followed her around like a loyal dog. It was smaller than the others, more subtle, but I could see it feeding on the despair and hopelessness that filled the hospital like a fog. "Marcus," she said during our first session, "I want you to know that you're safe here. Whatever you've been experiencing, we're going to help you work through it." I almost laughed. Safe. As if anywhere in the world was safe from what I'd unleashed. But I played along because I knew the alternative was a padded cell and a straitjacket, and I had work to do. The other patients were a mix of cops, firefighters, and EMTs who'd seen too much of the darkness that lived in the human heart. Most of them were heavily medicated, shuffling through the halls like zombies, but a few were like me. Their eyes held the same haunted look, the same terrible knowledge that there were things in the world that shouldn't exist. There was Jimmy Rodriguez, a firefighter who'd pulled too many bodies from too many fires. He kept talking about the voices he heard in the flames, about the shadows that danced in the smoke. The staff thought he was having auditory hallucinations, but I could see the truth. The things that rode the fire had marked him, just like they'd marked me. There was Linda Martinez, a paramedic who'd responded to a multiple homicide in the warehouse district. She described the scene in whispers, about the way the bodies had been arranged in a perfect circle, about the symbol carved into the concrete floor. The same symbol I'd seen in the basement, the same wound in the world that was slowly tearing reality apart. And there was David Park, a detective who'd investigated a series of disappearances in the old subway tunnels. He'd found evidence of something living down there, something that left behind nothing but bones and shadows. The official report blamed it on a serial killer, but David knew better. He'd seen the thing's eyes in the darkness, felt its hunger like a physical weight. We formed an unlikely alliance, 4 broken cops who'd glimpsed the truth behind the world's facade. We met in the common room during recreation time, sharing stories that the doctors dismissed as shared delusions. But we knew better. We were witnesses to something that was spreading through the city like a cancer, infecting everything it touched. The hospital itself was infected too. I could see it in the way the shadows moved through the halls, in the way patients would sometimes stop mid-sentence and stare at things that weren't there. The basement was calling to them, just like it had called to me, and every night more of them would disappear into the lower levels. I tried to warn the staff, but they just increased my medication and moved me to a more secure ward. The new room had no windows, no shadows for the things to hide in, but that didn't stop them. They lived in the walls now, in the pipes and wiring, feeding on the fear and madness that saturated the building like a stain. Dr. Hawthorne visited me every day, asking questions about my experiences, about the things I'd seen in the basement. She claimed to be helping me process my trauma, but I could see the truth. The shadow that followed her was growing stronger, more solid, fed by the stories of darkness and despair that filled our sessions. "Marcus," she said one day, her voice slightly different than usual, "I've been thinking about what you told me about the basement, about the symbol on the floor and the things you saw there. Have you considered that maybe you were meant to see them?" I looked at her more carefully, and for a moment her face flickered like a badly tuned television. The shadow behind her chair was grinning with too many teeth, and I realized with growing horror that it wasn't just following her anymore. It was wearing her, using her body like a suit of meat. "The wound is almost healed," she continued, and her voice was layered now, harmonizing with itself in impossible ways. "Soon, the barriers will fall completely, and your world will become ours. And you, Marcus, you're going to help us." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow wearing Dr. Hawthorne's face leaned forward, and I could smell the stench of old blood and rotting flowers on its breath. "You opened the door," it whispered. "You let us in. And now you're going to help us spread to every corner of this world, every person you've ever met, every place you've ever been, every memory you've ever cherished were going to corrupt it all. The room began to change around me. The walls stretched and warped, becoming the cracked concrete of the basement. The floor cracked open, revealing the symbol that had started it all, now glowing with a light that hurt to look at. And through the cracks, I could see them. Thousands of them, maybe millions, all waiting for their chance to taste our world. I woke up screaming, strapped to a bed in a room I didn't recognize. The walls were padded, and there were no windows, no sources of light except for a single fluorescent bulb that flickered constantly. A nurse I'd never seen before was standing beside the bed, holding a syringe filled with something that glowed faintly in the dim light. "Time for your medicine, Marcus," she said, and her voice was the same grinding sound I'd heard in the basement. "This will help you sleep, and when you wake up, you'll be ready to serve." I tried to fight, but the straps were too tight, and my body was weak from whatever they'd been giving me. The needle slid into my arm like a red-hot poker, and I felt something alien flooding my veins. It was cold and hungry and alive, and it was changing me from the inside out. As consciousness faded, I could hear them whispering in the walls, in the pipes, in the very air itself. They were everywhere now, in every shadow, every dark corner, every place where human suffering had left its mark. And they were all singing the same song, a lullaby of madness and despair that spoke of the end of everything I'd ever known. The last thing I remember is a voice, familiar and terrible, echoing from the depths of my own mind. It was Frank Reeves, or what was left of him, speaking through the void that had consumed his soul. "Welcome home, Marcus," he said, and I could hear him smiling in the darkness. "We've been waiting for you to join us. Now the real work can begin." I'm writing this in the few moments of clarity I have left, using smuggled paper and a pen I stole from one of the orderlies. The thing inside me is growing stronger every day, whispering suggestions that sound more and more reasonable as time goes on. Soon it will be strong enough to take control completely. And when it does, I'll become another herald, another servant of the darkness that waits beyond the wound in the world. If you're reading this, then you're already too late. The infection has spread beyond the basement, beyond the hospital, beyond any hope of containment. Every person who hears this story, every mind that comprehends what happened in that cursed place, becomes another doorway for them to slip through. But maybe that's the point. Maybe I was always meant to be their messenger, their prophet of the coming darkness. Maybe the tape that started this whole nightmare was never meant to be a warning, but an invitation. "Come to the basement," it said. "Come and see what waits in the shadows." And now, through my words, through my testimony, I'm extending that same invitation to you. The wound is almost healed, and when it is, there will be no more barriers between our world and theirs. The shadows will pour through like water through a broken dam, and everything you've ever known will become something else, something hungry and alive and utterly alien. So sleep well tonight, reader. Dream of concrete floors and symbols that move when you're not looking. Dream of voices in the walls and shadows that know your name. Because tomorrow, when you wake up, you might find that the nightmare has followed you home. The basement is everywhere now. The basement is everything, and the basement is calling you home. They're coming for me now. I can hear their footsteps in the hallway, wet and heavy like someone walking through puddles of blood. The orderlies are with them, but they're not orderlies anymore. They're something else, something that wears human faces like masks and speaks with voices that harmonize with the screaming of the damned. The thing inside me is laughing, and for the first time in months, I find myself laughing with it. Because I finally understand what Frank Reeves understood in his final moments. We were never the hunters. We were always the prey. And now, finally, it's time to stop running. The door is opening. The light is fading. And somewhere in the distance, I can hear the sound of something vast and terrible taking its first breath in our world. Welcome to the basement. Welcome to the end. Good evening, everyone. My name is Andrew, and I need to tell this story to someone who might understand the weight I carry. It all started with my best friend from college, Samuel. He was from a small town deep in the Appalachian Mountains, one of those places forgotten by time, and he always invited me to meet his family and see the land where he was born. During my last vacation, after months of his insistence, I finally agreed to go. I think the journey itself was already a warning. It took almost 9 hours in a stuffy van, bouncing endlessly on the winding mountain roads. The smell was a mixture of the plastic seats and the cheap disinfectant they used to clean the floor. We arrived when it was already pitch black, so I saw practically nothing. I only remember eating a bowl of hearty stew that his mother prepared and collapsing into bed immediately. The real strangeness began the next morning. When I opened the window of the guest room, I understood what Samuel meant by isolated. The place was squeezed into the bottom of a valley. Simple houses were stacked on top of each other on streets that climbed at an angle that seemed impossible. The surrounding mountains were so dense and tall they looked like walls swallowing the rooftops and letting through only slivers of light. There was no sound of cars or people talking loudly, just the constant buzz of insects and a heavy silence, the kind of silence that weighs on you. It was beautiful in a rustic way, but the first thing I felt was not peace, but the clear sensation that I did not belong in that place and that the entire town knew it. After breakfast, some strong mountain coffee, freshly made, Samuel invited me to take a walk to see the rest of the town. The streets were dirt or old, irregular stones, and we had to walk carefully not to twist an ankle. The few people we encountered looked at me in a way that was not exactly hostile. It was just a look that measured me, knowing I was not from there. They greeted Samuel with a brief nod, and their eyes returned to me for a second. It was on one of those more remote streets that I saw the building. It was a more modern construction than the houses, 2 stories, with white paint completely peeling from time, stained with mold. It had the structure of a small health center or clinic, but it looked abandoned. Weeds had taken over the surrounding land, and some of the glass windows were broken. When we passed right in front of it, Samuel, who had been telling me a fishing story, fell silent mid-sentence. He lowered his head for a moment and made the sign of the cross, a quick, almost automatic gesture. I stopped walking. Never in my life had I seen someone cross themselves in front of a hospital. The scene was so out of place that I ended up making a stupid joke. Hey, did they change God's address and forget to tell us? He turned to me immediately, and the expression on his face had nothing funny about it. It was a cold seriousness, a hardness in his gaze that I had never seen in him. My smile disappeared instantly. I felt my face heat up with shame. He did not respond, just nodded for us to keep walking. The rest of the walk passed in heavy silence, and the image of that gesture toward a ruined building would not leave my head. We walked in silence to the only diner in town. It was just a small door with a worn metal counter and some plastic tables on the sidewalk. We ordered 2-plate lunches, those with rice, beans, and a fried egg, and coffee. I suppose the atmosphere, the smell of food being prepared, helped break the ice. It was then that Samuel leaned over the table, as if he was going to tell me a secret, and his voice came out low. "Andrew, what I am going to tell you now is not the kind of thing we tell just anyone. You have to understand that here life works differently. All this land we are walking on has an owner, and he does not like people touching what is his without asking permission." He paused, took a sip of coffee. The cup trembled slightly in his hand. "That clinic was built about 30 years ago. People from the city came to build it. They arrived, cleared the land, put up the building, and made no offering. They asked no permission. To give you an idea, if a resident here is going to build a chicken coop, they leave a bottle of moonshine or some tobacco at the site. It is a sign of respect. The engineers did absolutely nothing." Samuel pushed the food from one side of the plate to the other with his fork, but did not eat. The clinic barely opened, and things started to go wrong. Whoever entered there with a problem came out with a much worse one. A guy broke his leg, it got infected out of nowhere, and in less than a week he was gone. Any woman who went to give birth there lost the baby, or the child died within a few days without any explanation from the doctors. It did not take long for people to refuse to set foot inside. It became a shortcut to the cemetery. His voice became even lower, confidential. The clinic director, a very proud man, saw that he was going to lose his job. With no choice, he swallowed his pride and went to look for Miss Alina, the oldest and most respected healer here. He told her everything. The old woman just listened quietly. In the end, she looked at him intently and said, "The owner of the land is offended. You opened a wound in him, and now he collects payment, and the debt is high. He wants the lives of 12 newborns to appease his spirit." I stopped chewing. I looked discreetly around, but the diner owner was cleaning the counter, and another customer was reading an old newspaper without paying attention to our conversation. The man went pale, turned around and left, but news in a small place flies. In one day everyone already knew, and here Miss Alina's word is not questioned. For a while the clinic was empty. That is when the babies started to disappear, one here, another there. They disappeared from their cribs. At night, no one made a scene. No one called the police, who barely exist around here. The parents accepted it in silence. They understood it was a sacrifice for the good of everyone, that their child was going to guarantee the health of the rest of the town. 12. Exactly 12 disappeared. Finally, he looked at me, and his gaze was heavy. After the 12th disappeared, the clinic started working again and never had a single problem. To this day, it is like that. That is why I cross myself. It is a sign of respect. We know that ground was paid for with the lives of innocents. It is a debt that is settled, but not forgotten. And debts like that, one does not provoke. After that, he started eating for real, as if he had freed himself from an enormous weight. I could not swallow anything more. The taste of coffee in my mouth suddenly became bitter. The rest of that day passed slowly, heavily. Samuel tried to act normally, showing me a stream that ran behind his house, making plans to go fishing the next day. But I could not concentrate. The story of the clinic had gotten into my head and would not come out. Every face of a resident who crossed my path seemed to guard the same secret. It was as if everyone there was part of a silent pact, a shared knowledge that excluded me and marked me even more as an intruder. Part of me, the part that grew up in an apartment building, that uses public transportation, and thinks it understands how the world works, insisted that all of that was nothing more than collective madness. A small town legend created to make sense of things. And being honest, the explanation was logical. Deaths in rural and poorly equipped hospitals occur. Children can disappear for 1,000 reasons. People invent stories to make sense of things. It was a defense mechanism. But the other part of me, the one that felt the heavy air of the valley as soon as I arrived, the one that saw the almost sacred seriousness in my best friend's gaze, that part was genuinely scared, and that fear irritated me deeply because I did not want to believe in that. Being afraid of a town story made me feel ridiculous, a slave to superstition. At the end of the afternoon, the opportunity arose. Samuel went to help his father repair a fence at the back of the property, a job that would take them a good while. I told him I would stay on the porch reading a book. It was an easy lie. As soon as the two of them walked away, I felt an impulse, an almost childish need to challenge that story. It was like an itch in my brain. I needed physical proof that all of that was nonsense. I retraced the path through the dirt streets. My heart began to beat faster, which only irritated me more. "It's just an abandoned building, Andrew. Enough already," I repeated mentally. Soon I was there, standing on the other side of the street, looking at the clinic. The low afternoon sun cast long shadows from the trees that crawled across the facade of the building. The silence there was different. It was not peace, it was absence. It seemed that even the buzzing of insects died before reaching that ground. I stood there for a while, just observing the weeds, the paint, the broken glass. It was just an old, decaying place. There was nothing special or threatening about it. So why Samuel's gesture? Why did his voice tremble when telling the story? The anger with myself for being there standing pushed me. I needed a concrete act, a small gesture of defiance that would prove once, and for all that the only power of that place was in people's minds. I slowly crossed the street and stepped on the dry grass of the lot. Each step seemed to sound too loud. My eyes scanned the ground near the entrance steps. There was debris, pieces of concrete, remains from the construction. That is probably when I saw it. A piece of tile half buried in the dirt. It was a childish blue, different from everything I had seen around there, with the drawing of a little sun almost erased. A piece that surely came from the old pediatric area. I hesitated for a moment. Samuel's voice talking about the debt and the owner sounded clear in my mind, but my logic, my city man's skepticism screamed louder. "It's just garbage." I bent down suddenly. The movement was almost a spasm. My hand was wet with sweat when my fingers touched the object. It was cold and had rough edges. Without thinking more, I put it in my pants pocket, turned my back to the clinic, and left there at a fast pace, without looking back, with the bitter sensation of someone who had just made a serious mistake, but without being able to understand exactly why. I returned to Samuel's house, feeling like a complete idiot. During dinner, I could barely speak, answering his mother's questions with short sentences. The weight of the piece of tile in my pants pocket seemed real, as if it were a small stone pulling me down. I made up the excuse that I was still tired from the trip and went to my room earlier. In the room, I took the piece of tile out of my pocket and left it on the nightstand by the lamp. My bravery from hours before seemed pathetic. The object was just that, a fragment of old and dirty ceramic. I tried to force myself to feel the relief of completed proof, but what I felt was a strange cold, a cold that did not come from the window, but from within me, and that brought with it a nausea that churned my stomach. I went to bed blaming dinner. That is when I heard the first sound. It came from the patio, a dragging noise on the dirt. Slow, heavy, that stopped and started again. It sounded like someone pulling a heavy bag, stopping for a few seconds before continuing. The first logical thought was some animal, a large dog looking through the trash. I remained completely still in bed, just listening. The sound stopped right under my room's window. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise. I held my breath waiting. Nothing. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, but the words sounded hollow in my mind. Sleep disappeared. My whole body was tense in a state of alert. Any creaking of the house's wood scared me. The nausea worsened, and a cold sweat began to form on my forehead and neck. And then the sound returned, but this time it was different. It was not in the patio. It was on the exterior wall of my room, a slow scratch, as if on purpose from top to bottom, as if very long nails or the tip of a dry branch were scraping the plaster. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound stopped and restarted each time with more force, more insistence. I jumped out of bed. My whole body was shaking in a way I could not control. I ran to the room door and turned the small metal lock, an instinctive and useless gesture that gave me a second of ridiculous comfort. At the same instant, the door handle turned slowly from the other side. Someone pushed the wood that hit the lock with a dry click. "Andrew," it was Samuel's muffled voice. "Open up, man. Are you okay?" The relief was so immense that my legs almost gave out. I unlocked the door, and he entered already in pajamas, with his face wrinkled from sleep and an expression of concern. "What happened? You are pale. My mother said she heard you walking back and forth." "I don't know, I don't feel well," I started to say. But he was no longer looking at me. Samuel's gaze passed over my shoulder and fixed on the nightstand. He approached slowly, holding his breath. His fingers touched the edge of the piece of tile without touching the drawing. The color disappeared from his face. The concern faded, giving way to an expression of dread that I will never forget. "The little son," he whispered in a voice so low it was barely audible. "It was from the nursery wall. Andrew, where did you get this?" I did not need to answer. He knew immediately. It clicked for him instantly. He took a step back, stumbling against the door frame. "No, no, no, no," he repeated, shaking his head. "What did you do? Tell me, what did you do?" "Sam, calm down. It's just a piece of—" "It's not just a piece." He interrupted me with his voice about to become a contained scream full of panic. "You don't understand, man. You took something from there. You opened the dead again. He knows you took it." At that moment, the scratching sound on the wall resumed. Louder, more furious. We both stood paralyzed. His gaze met mine, and the terror I saw there ended any doubt I still had. It was the fear of someone who not only believes in the legend, but knows with absolute certainty that it is happening again. "He came to collect," Samuel said, his voice completely broken. "And the payment now is you." There was no more time to think. Samuel's panic took over everything. He grabbed my arm hard and pulled me out of the room. "Grab your things now. You cannot stay here until morning for any reason." while I stuffed my clothes into my backpack any way I could, with trembling hands. He ran to the nightstand using the edge of his own shirt so as not to touch it with his fingers. He took the piece of tile. "We have to return this," he said with a tense voice. "We have to leave it where you found it. It is our only chance." We went out through the back door, plunging into the total darkness of the night. His father had an old car, a very worn-out sedan. The engine started on the third try, and each second of silence, while the key turned, was agony. The trip through the dirt streets, without a single streetlight to guide the way, was the most terrifying experience of my life. I looked at the dark bushes on the edge of the road, expecting to see something move, but there was only blackness. Samuel did not say a word, just drove with his hands so tight on the steering wheel that his knuckles looked white. He stopped the car at a distance he considered safe from the clinic. "Leave that thing there on the edge of the road and apologize. Say it out loud. Ask forgiveness for your ignorance. Quick." I got out feeling weak in the legs. I walked to the edge of the lot and placed the tile on the ground as carefully as possible. I whispered an apology that sounded pathetic and false, even to my own ears. I ran back to the car, and Samuel accelerated, screeching tires on the dirt. He did not take me back to his house. He drove for almost an hour until we reached the main highway, where there was a stop where the first bus to the capital passed around 4 in the morning. "Don't come back here, Andrew, never again," was the last thing he said to me before leaving me in the darkness and turning around. I managed to leave. I returned to my apartment, to the noise of cars, to my usual life, but I know that a part of that place came with me. It has been 6 months now. I do not sleep a full night. Any creaking in the building puts me on alert. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I feel that same internal cold, and the nausea returns with everything. But the worst is the smell. From time to time, out of nowhere, my room fills with a strong smell of wet earth and rotting leaves. I do not know if my apology was enough. I do not know if the debt I opened was really settled, or if, by taking that piece of garbage, I only served to let the owner of that place know that there was a new debtor, and that now he knows exactly where to find me. My name is Victor Pereira, and I grew up on a ranch of red dirt planted in the rough hills of East Texas, far enough for the radio signal to get lost when the clouds carried rain, and close enough for the small town gossip to always arrive late, but arrive nonetheless. My father, Don Virgil, my older brother Andrew, and I lived there. Our mother, Alina, disappeared when I was 6 years old. Every time I wanted to ask something, Dad would just scratch his chin, spit to the side, and return to whatever he was doing. Although the house was small, made of dark wood and handmade tiles, inside there was plenty of silent space. The routine was simple. Get up before the rooster crowed, put coffee in the pot on the stove, release the chickens, and then walk to the neighboring sugar cane fields where Dad cleaned furrows for daily wages. He would leave for 2 or 3 days, sometimes more, depending on demand. During that time, Andrew commanded, and I obeyed without question. He taught me to stoke the fire properly, to sprinkle cornmeal against the wind to drive away the evil spirits. I still don't understand how it works, but I keep doing it, and to recognize the rattle of the rattlesnake before it was too late. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until the second semester of the year. I turned 12. It started slowly. Calves were born with grayish skin, far from the healthy brown we expected. The neighbor's well below dried up overnight. A pregnant girl from the road swore she saw a slender shadow cross the cornfield during the waning moon. We heard it, commented on it in low voices, and let it pass because the harvest doesn't wait for anyone's fear. That's when Dad returned from a haul bringing a tall, dark woman with eyes uncertain about whether they liked the landscape. She arrived on the back of the mule, dressed in a long skirt and carrying a raw canvas bag. Her name was Dora, and Dad announced with a dry voice like someone reading the price of sugar that she would stay. At dinner, she served a thick addle with broth and cut off any questions with a smile that showed no teeth. I can't explain it, but that gesture seemed too gratuitous for someone who had just met the family. In the first week, Dora rearranged closets, moved the bed, and hung crocheted cloths behind the doors. She assured us that this drove away sick air. Very early, while Andrew and I took care of the animals, she would nail white candles in the corners of the patio and trace a cross in the air over each one. When Andrew was surprised, she simply said, "A place so forgotten needs light." And that was that. One afternoon, I was peeling yucca when I broke a plate. Dora picked up the pieces, wrapped them in a dirty rag, and went to bury them behind the pig pen. Broken glass collects the evil eye. She released that explanation and returned to the kitchen without caring about my question mark face. Soon it became a rule. Andrew and I were forbidden to touch the pots when she wasn't around. I asked why and received a look that was hard and soft like stone at the same time. I accepted in silence, but something gnawed at me inside. Andrew, 5 years older, suddenly started losing weight. First a low fever at dusk, then nausea at the first sip of broth. Within a few weeks, he was dragging his sandals as if they were sacks. Dad got a ride in a milk truck and took his son to the rural clinic. They returned with a diagnosis of anemia and a bag of iron tablets. Needless to say, it didn't help. One cloudy morning, I found something buried shallow at the foot of the clay oven. The previous night's rain had uncovered the tip of a piece of black cloth. I dug with my hands, fearing to find a dead rat, but the bundle contained a pale, thick wax doll with fine thorns stuck in its head and chest. Written in charcoal was Andrew's name. A chill ran through me without any wind blowing. I took it to Dad, who was sharpening a machete. He examined it too long, then threw it into the stove brazier without saying a word. The doll crackled, melted, smelling of old tallow. That same night, I heard whispers in the kitchen. Dad and Dora spoke low, voices sliding like a snake over dry leaves. I managed to hear some words: break the order, reinforce the bond, and my neck hair stood on end. I wanted to wake Andrew, but he was moaning feverish, eyes rolled back in half-sleep. 2 days later, a man named Don Mateo arrived. He said he came on behalf of our grandmother, Alina's mother, who lived in another county. He wore a palm hat, short cassock, and carried a sack full of leaves. He looked at Andrew without touching him, toured the entire room, and asked permission to see Dora's chamber. Dad hesitated but agreed while Dora washed clothes at the river. The healer lifted a loose floorboard. There, among damp earth and dust, he found a small bottle that contained what looked like a piece of dried umbilical cord tied to an old medal. I recognized the medal. It was Mom's, hanging from a portrait kept in Dad's trunk. "Here's the root of the work," Don Mateo murmured. "It was planted to sicken from within. We must pull it out by the root, or the plague changes bodies. It was night when he lit tallow candles on the terrace, scattered coarse salt around the door, and passed a black egg over Andrew's body, repeating prayers that sounded like ancient oaths. When the egg cracked by itself, no one had to prove that something was wrong. A thick, dark liquid like burnt molasses oozed out, smelling of rust and rotten eggs. We had to leave the house while the healer fumigated everything with rue. By dawn, Dora had disappeared. The hammock where she slept swayed empty. Her clothes were still dripping on the clothesline. The mule remained tied to the trunk, but there was no trace of her. Dad sat on the threshold, unlit cigarette between his fingers, and stayed there until the sun went orange behind the hills. He didn't pronounce her name once. Andrew had a truce for a few days. He could eat tortillas, helped fix the gate. I saw him trying to smile, but soon the fever returned with force. At night, he whispered tangled words in an unknown language. One morning, I noticed deep scratches on his ankles, as if made by claws. Dad pretended not to see them, perhaps out of fear of admitting the obvious. I called Don Mateo again. He arrived before nightfall, heavy countenance. The old work didn't die, it just shed its skin. The woman left the door open. He said we had to go to the abandoned sugar mill where Dora often stayed alone. Dad confirmed it. He had taken her there for firewood, and she always asked to return alone, always claiming curiosity about the old walls. We left the next day before first light, me, Dad, and the healer. We climbed the narrow path, passed through the dry, muddy area where the clay refused to crack, and arrived at the mill's big house. Fallen ruins that nobody touched for fear of snakes. Inside, it smelled of stagnant dust. Don Mateo walked in a circle, murmured prayers, and then dug next to a fallen pillar. He unearthed a dark wooden box secured with crooked wires. Inside was damp earth, Mom's metal, and a rosary of beads tangled in hair braids. "Here's the nest, Victor," he said, looking at me firmly. "We must burn this heart and seal the ground before night appears." We returned with the box wrapped in a flour sack. In the patio, Don Mateo set up an altar with dried corn, mezcal, water from the well, and 3 black chickens bought in haste from Don Jonas. He slaughtered the birds, mixed the blood with the earth from the box, and chanted grave songs that seemed to come from other lungs. I watched on my knees, hands crossed, without blinking. In a final gesture, he threw the box into the fire. It burned without flame, turned to ash without releasing smoke. The wind carried every gray point too silently. Andrew slept for hours straight, something he hadn't done in weeks. When he woke up, his eyes were black with no division between iris and pupil. He didn't seem scared. On the contrary, he said he saw things people refused to see. Dad crossed himself so many times, he almost opened his forehead. The following days brought a different Andrew. Same gentle smile, but without haste or slang, talking about remedies he read in books no one owned. People from the small town started coming asking for a quick blessing. He accepted eggs, flour, never money. Dad didn't approve. Then a man in a black suit arrived, shiny car with plates from another state. He carried his son in his arms, bleeding from his ears, babbling. He offered lands, cattle, money. Dad refused. Andrew asked to touch the boy's forehead. He barely touched it, stepped back. "He's already been claimed," he whispered, and the indignant man left cursing. At night, the dogs barked so much that their voices seemed to multiply. I spied through the window crack and saw strange marks forming on the gate. Crossed circles, arrows pointing inward, a symbol that resembled a fish with claws. Don Mateo appeared running, sweaty, and ordered us to salt the windows, cover the mirrors with black cloth, and plant mother-in-law's tongue around the door. It worked for a few days, but every night knocks surrounded the terrace. Sometimes we saw by lamplight the shadow of someone very tall, with a long braid crossing the patio slowly, as if measuring the pace. When we opened, only mud footprints remained. Meanwhile, Andrew became increasingly distant. He spent hours writing symbols on pieces of paper, then burning them without explaining. One night, he called me. He carried a black candle, a canvas bag, and a roll of sisal rope. He wanted me to accompany him to the mill. I didn't argue. We walked without words. The woods were so silent it hurt. In the inner courtyard, Andrew dug with bare hands, placed a clay figurine, a woman without a face, goat legs. He covered it with earth mixed with white ash and tied the rope to a broken pillar, leaving the end loose. It's a seal. If someone steps with anger, it wakes everything around. He looked at me with still black eyes and added, "Let's hope no one steps. Let's hope." Returning, we found the kitchen upside down. On the table, wet clay drew the word awake. Worms writhed, forming the outlines of the letters. Don Mateo paled. Clear message. The woman not only knows the seal, but is already preparing to break it. Days later, neighbor Sepha, who had helped Andrew in his fevers, died choking on her own saliva, mouth full of ash still hot from the brazier. They waked her quickly. At the burial, no one approached our family. Curiously, it drizzled the next day, but the water that drained from the eaves left rust-colored stains on the ground. The wind blew soundlessly, as if someone had emptied the center of the world. Don Mateo fell ill almost as quickly as Sepha. Dark sores opened all over his body. He asked to be taken to a hut at the top of the hill where a hermit used to live. He died that same night before the lamp used half the kerosene. Andrew buried his books and bottles under the dry cedar in the patio, marking the trunk with a broken-tipped knife. From then on, Andrew woke before sunrise, painted symbols on his chest with charcoal and grease, and recited prayers I never heard in any church. The animals acted strange. Chickens flapped wings silently, dogs barked at nothing. The remaining mule broke its neck in a silly stumble when the wind moved the gate. One afternoon, returning from the cane field, I saw Dora at the edge of the road, bare feet, skirt licking the mud, braid hitting her hip. Seeing me, she smiled without moving her lips. She vanished behind the bamboo grove as if the woods had swallowed her. The air hardened with terror. I ran back with short breath, but I couldn't tell about it until dawn. Andrew found me in the kitchen, trembling. He said the mill seal must already be cracked. He forbade speaking aloud after sunset, ensuring that there are words that are doors. He ordered covering the lamp with thick blanket to prevent light from being seen from outside. That same night, he took me to Mom's little room, closed since her disappearance. Under some loose boards, we found a box with old letters. In one, Mom told that in dreams, a woman with an elongated face visited her, offering protection in exchange for silence. When she got pregnant with Andrew, the woman returned demanding the child at 9 years old. Mom fled far away, but according to the letter, she feared the debt had no expiration date. Andrew burned everything and scattered the ashes in the patio. The following days dragged without wind, without bird song, without the smell of roasted coffee. Food spoiled quickly. Sugar became stone. Rice got moldy even when sealed. It seemed that time refused to advance. At dawn on a Monday, I heard footsteps on the roof, paced heavy, as if bare feet were looking for loose boards. Dad pointed a shotgun without cartridges at the ceiling, eyes bulging. Outside, Mom's voice called softly, "Children, open up. It's cold," in a tone that broke me inside. But we didn't open. We remained locked until the rooster crowed. When the first ray of sun hit, absolute silence. I went to the patio and counted dozens of footprints that didn't look like human feet or any known beast, all pointing to the door. Andrew came out shortly after, wrapped in a white sheet. He carried something inside raw canvas. He said it was time for the final adjustment. In the middle of the patio, he placed the empty bundle, poured mezcal, and set it on fire. The flame rose greenish, smelling of rotten leaf and burnt cane. The ground trembled as if breathing. Dora appeared in the shadow of the mango tree. Her face was a mask without expression, too dark for common skin. Dad fired. The shot went through her, hit the fence, and the weapon exploded in his hand. He fell screaming in pain. I went to help him, but Andrew grabbed my shoulder. "Close the house and protect the well. If you hear my name, don't answer." I dragged Dad inside, barricaded the door, crossed the well cover with a rod, and prayed what I remembered. Outside, screams mixed with the creaking of old wood. At some point, I heard children's laughter and women's crying all at once. Then came a silence that cut the eardrums. When courage appeared, I opened the door. The patio was covered with thick ash. Andrew's shirt rested folded on a stone in the middle of the ground. 3 crossed lines inside a circle, the symbol Mom drew in the dirt when she prayed at night. It rained hard 2 days later. Dark water washed part of the ash, but left a rust smell. Dad lost sight in one eye from the weapon explosion. He spends afternoons rocking in the chair, murmuring his son's name. I sealed the well with quicklime and coarse salt. I covered it with iron grating and nailed a wooden cross without blessing. Every night, I sit beside it, lamp low, and listen to whispers that sound like a child's voice mixed with an old woman's. I never answer. The abandoned mill creaks in the wind, and there are those who swear that green lights dance in the ruins when the heavy rain falls. The ground of our patio exhales warm vapor like the breath of a sleeping creature. People from the small town cross the path quickly to avoid passing in front. No one asks about Andrew. No one mentions Dora. And every time I hear a different creak at dawn, remember the smile that never showed teeth and the wax doll with thorns in its head. If you've listened this far, please don't step on the mill. Don't uncover the well. Don't pick up anything the rain uncovers. There are packs that only sleep. A hand too gentle is enough to wake the hungry ones. Some debts are inherited, some curses run in the blood, and some bargains are made by people who never intended to pay the price themselves. The sugar mill still stands, a monument to the deals made in desperation and the prices paid by those who come after. And somewhere in the red dirt of East Texas, the earth still breathes, still waits, still remembers the taste of sacrifice and the weight of promises that can never be broken. That's the legacy my family left me, not land or money, but the knowledge that some hungers are older than memory, and some debts are written in languages that predate words. The mill may be abandoned, but it's not empty. It's never been empty, and it's always looking for the next generation, to honor the contracts their ancestors signed in blood and desperation. If you ever find yourself in East Texas and you see an old sugar mill crumbling in the distance, drive faster. Don't stop. Don't look too long. And whatever you do, don't go inside. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. And some things, once awakened, never go back to sleep. I was 17, and my brother was 21. Ever since he turned 18, he started getting out of control, hanging around with people he shouldn't, and ended up mixed up in dangerous things, running with guys who don't forgive even the smallest mistake. My parents had to take him far away to hide him. Meanwhile, they sent me to live with my grandmother in Montana, in a small town with few streets and wilderness at the edge. If you walked further, you'd find mountains. I didn't go with them because I had to keep going to school, though honestly all I wanted to do was sleep and let time pass quickly. The first days at my grandmother's house were strange. Everything was too quiet. It was during one of those days that I adopted a dog. Well, actually, I didn't adopt him. I found him. I was walking where the mountain began, and there he was, alone. I called to him, and he came over. We played for a while. I offered him what I had brought to eat, a peanut butter sandwich my grandmother had made for me. He smelled it and ate it slowly, without anxiety. When I headed back, I had to shout at him several times to stay in the woods because he was following me. I stopped, scolded him, told him to go back, and then he disappeared into some bushes, just as if he had never been there. I was left with that image in my head, not so much from the fright, but from how strange it all was. A day or two later, I went back to the same place. I don't know why, and there he was sitting waiting for me. As soon as he saw me, he got excited, wagged his tail, approached me slowly, as if he already knew me from before. I gave him something to eat again. I stayed with him for a while, and then went back. This time he followed me, but obeyed when I told him to go back. He would look at me, stop, and then turn around without making noise. Something in his movements wasn't completely canine. I told my grandmother about him. She asked me if he was aggressive, if he obeyed me, if he looked healthy. I told her he was very obedient, that he almost seemed to understand English. Then she told me that if he was as smart as I said, I should bring him home, that he would help us take care of the chickens and rabbits, because we had been losing animals for days because of coyotes. So I did. The dog turned out to be very good. The house came into order. The coyotes stopped getting in. That animal was completely black. He didn't have a single spot, not even on his paws. His fur was shiny, but not thin. It was rather thick, like a German shepherd, but without any other color. His eyes were strange, not just because of the color, but because of what they conveyed. He would look at you steadily, and it seemed like he was thinking. My grandmother named him Devil, and I don't know if it was a joke or if she felt it from the beginning. I became very fond of that dog. He obeyed me in everything. He really seemed to understand words. He accompanied me everywhere. He slept near the door, positioned himself between me and anyone who came. And when I felt sad, he would sit in front of me just to watch me. He never got too close. My grandmother loved him too. She said he was the only animal that gave her peace, that she didn't have to yell at him, and that the chickens had been calmer since he arrived. One day, right on that path where I first found him, a man confronted me. Devil had stayed a bit behind sniffing something. That man had a horrible vibe. He started asking me strange, personal questions. I got nervous. The first thing I thought was to call my dog. I shouted, "Devil, come," and he came. Immediately, he went after the guy, and with one bite, he tore into his neck. I just wanted him to scare him away, to bark loudly at him, but he attacked with a violence that left me frozen. He knocked him down and tore off his arm with a horrible, awful movement, one bite and a shake. It wasn't a pull, it wasn't a scratch. He tore it completely off, left it hanging. I ran back terrified. I threw up twice on the way. I couldn't stop seeing that image. The raw flesh, the bone in the air, the arm completely twisted, as if they had torn it off and stuck it back on backwards. The worst part was seeing Devil come trotting behind me calm, with his muzzle dripping blood. I rinsed him in a stream before getting home. I didn't want my grandmother to see him like that. 2 days later, the news came out. They had found a dead man on the mountainside. I didn't say anything. I was paralyzed by fear, by guilt. All the time I felt like someone was watching me, like they knew the dog was mine. Every time I heard footsteps in the vegetation, I wanted to hide. But then another piece of news came out, that the man wasn't alone, that he had gone up the mountain to bury a body, that of a woman. It was then that I forced myself to think that Devil did the right thing, that if that guy had done that to her, who knows what he would have done to me. That animal was something very special. He took care of me like no one else. He accompanied me to the bus stop, and I don't know if he stayed there waiting for me, or if he knew exactly what time I was going to return. But when I got off the bus, he was always there. He never let me walk alone. If I went to the store, if I walked to the field, if I went to a neighbor's house, he went a few yards behind, quiet, steady. I swear there was something strange about him. There were nights when I would wake up and see him sitting in front of the door with his back to me. But in the darkness, he looked bigger, as if he were another huge animal, much more alert than a dog should be. One day when I returned from school, I found my grandmother crying. I saw her sitting in the plastic-covered chair with her gaze down and her hands shaking on her knees. I got scared. She told me that the neighbor had done her wrong, that she had yelled at her, that she had humiliated her in front of other women, that she had called her a stupid old woman, just like that for no reason, and that she had even pushed her. My grandmother was touching her forehead with her palm and murmuring that maybe that woman was right, that she was already feeling like a useless old woman. I hugged her. I got angry. I felt my heart tight from seeing her like that. Then I noticed that Devil was there standing nearby, with his head tilted looking at us. He didn't make any noise, didn't growl, didn't whine, but I swear I felt like he was asking me for permission. It was a very clear sensation, as if he was asking me with his eyes, "Do you want me to fix it?" I stared at him, and without thinking I told him quietly to go away, that it wasn't a good time, that my grandmother was sad, that someone had made her that way. As I was telling him this, I had that movie-like certainty that he was understanding every word, not by tone, but by the exact words, by what they meant. It didn't take long for the whole truth to come out, that the neighbor didn't just insult my grandmother, but also slapped her, and that out of shame she hadn't wanted to tell me. Devil got out. The next day, early in the morning, the street filled with people. You could hear murmurs from behind the fences. Then patrol cars came, sirens, screams. Someone had torn the neighbor's face off. I'm not exaggerating. They didn't scratch it, they didn't hit it, they tore it off with one bite. And again Devil was in the yard as if nothing had happened, with his muzzle stained. My grandmother told me firmly, though it was hard for her, that she was going to have to take that animal to the woods. I told her we couldn't, that the dog would follow me, and then she gave me a rope. "You tie him up or I'll kill him." I loved that dog so much that horrible things went through my mind. I took him tied up. We walked toward the mountain in silence. He didn't resist. He kept looking at me with those strange eyes that no longer seemed like a dog's, but like someone who carries many lives on his back. Before letting him go, I told him he couldn't stay at the house, that it hurt me to my heart. He obeyed me, and I broke inside. 2 days later, Devil returned to my grandmother's house. I heard him dragging something. I went out to the yard, and there he was. He had half a pig hanging from his muzzle. It had no broken bones, no bullet marks, no signs that he had stolen it from some farm. He had killed it himself, alone. It was his offering, his way of asking for forgiveness. My grandmother, without saying a word, dug a hole in the loose earth of the yard and threw in half the pig. She covered it with dirt and stomped it down with her feet. She said she didn't want to see any more. Not even hours later it was learned that in the town square they found the lower part of a man's body, from the waist down, thrown behind a bench. I felt something in my throat, a scream that wanted to escape. The dog brought the top part, and people found the bottom part. But then it wasn't about a pig buried in the garden. It was someone who was murdered while transformed into an animal. The police said he had been attacked by a beast. I no longer knew what to say. For me at that moment there was no doubt. Devil was something else, a shapeshifter, an entity, a guardian. He understood me, he felt me, he defended me. Like I'm telling you, the pig he brought wasn't a pig. There in the hole that grandmother dug must be the other half of that man. When my parents' situation was finally resolved, I went back to live in the city. I had to leave Devil in the town. It was impossible for him to live in an apartment or in the city or with people. I cried for exactly 2 weeks, not 1 day more. Then, determined, I took a bus, went back to my grandmother's town, and went straight to the mountain to look for Devil. I shouted his name, walked the paths, left food where we first met, but Devil never appeared again. Hello, friends of horror tales. Welcome to this new episode we have for you. It's a somewhat raw story, especially if you're listening to us, and we had to soften some graphic situations. This story might start and not be as paranormal as the rest of the stories we hear here. But believe me, it's a situation that's frightening, especially in this America we live in today. The disappearance of Luna, based on a true experience. Luna's body was found with 3 other bodies inside a car that had been set on fire, but the rain had extinguished it hours later. She had marks of torture and signs of other types of violence. We cannot assure who it was, but we are very sure that whoever participated in the whole event was that limping man, that freak. What I'm about to tell you happened in 2017 when my school group got together to go to the Mardi Gras celebration in New Orleans. I must say we didn't even make it there. Luna's disappearance changed our lives forever. I'm originally from Beaumont, Texas. I was studying high school there at that time. My group of friends and I wanted to go to New Orleans Mardi Gras for the first time, since it had a reputation for being one of the best in the country. And generally, many acquaintances went every year. mainly because of the proximity. We were already in our senior year of high school when we finally had permission from our parents. Those of us who ventured out were a total of 13 people, but divided into 3 cars. I have to be a bit specific about this because the authorities tried to blame us to divert attention. In the first car, there were 4 people. A classmate with her boyfriend who was driving, another classmate, and his girlfriend. The second car was the one I was in, along with a cousin and 2 more classmates. And in the third car, which was bigger, Luna went with 2 more female classmates and one of their boyfriends, as well as the classmate who was driving. The original plan was to take Interstate 10 and get to New Orleans faster. But a phone call made the third car head toward the town of Orange, Texas. Those of us in the second car decided to go with them, since they were supposed to pick up another person in town, and from there they would go via the route through Lafayette. The route was going to be longer, but we were still making good time. Those in the first car went down the interstate as planned to get to the hotel and book the rooms. In Orange, we lost a lot of time. The person they were going to pick up finally said they couldn't make it, and although they tried to convince them, their family refused, so we had to continue on our way. Sometimes, when I remember all this, I think we should have been stronger when making decisions. We should have insisted on going back to the interstate and not continuing toward Beaumont. But because we were messing around, we let the one driving car, number 3, make the decisions. We arrived in Beaumont and stopped again to buy beer and something to eat. We looked for a supposed acquaintance of one of the girls to get food, but we couldn't find him. There we lost almost 2 more hours. At this rate, we would arrive in New Orleans almost in time for the night parade. Coming out of a gas station, we saw a man who was missing a leg and was using a kind of hat to cover himself from the sun. He approached our friend's car and struck up a conversation with them. When the girls came out of the store, the limping man approached them to hold the door, and then opened the truck door for Luna, whose hand he kissed. This made everyone laugh and call me crazy, but for me, that was the moment he marked her. We headed toward the port of New Orleans, and when passing through the city of Lafayette, already in Louisiana, a rather strange pickup truck passed us, and then drastically reduced speed. Things at that time were the same or worse than now in terms of insecurity, so we imagined the worst. We began to advance at higher speed looking for a highway patrol officer, but for several miles we saw nothing. We thought about stopping in Baton Rouge, but the fear that they were people from there made us continue, until we came across 2 more pickup trucks. At this point, we had already called our homes to warn them what was happening to us. The advice from my classmate's dad was, don't stop until you see a military or highway patrol officer. If you see state police, don't stop because they're going to screw you over. Those in the other vehicle couldn't stand the pressure and stopped under pressure from the strange pickup trucks, very close to reaching a town whose name I don't remember. We advanced to a truck stop where we saw a federal police officer and told him what had happened. Immediately, the officer asked us questions and tried to communicate with his colleagues on the road, but he wasn't doing anything to go help our friends. We asked him to please come with us, but he told us he was sending someone else there. About 20 minutes passed, and then we received a call. They took Luna. The screams were of total desperation and fear. The one who hadn't been marked couldn't control herself, and the other voices were of pure confusion. The officer heard part of the call, and that's when he decided to go to the place. When we arrived, we saw them on the side of the road crying. They had been robbed of almost everything. The phone they called us from was one of the friend's work phones that she had hidden. The kidnappers headed toward the communities that connect with the bayous, places where you'll hardly find anyone and where the police can't patrol. That's where the real ordeal began for all of us. Our families, lawyers, statements, lies, tricks to turn us against each other, and fear. There really was a lot of fear. Up to here, I know many will think this is a story like thousands of others that happen on America's highways. Another story about violence and kidnappings. But there's something that, for us, turns out to be a bit more supernatural. 5 of us began to see and dream about Luna, but in a way that few understood. 2 months had passed since Luna disappeared. Some of the group, Diego, Faye, Leo, Brenda, and I, tried to continue with our lives, but her absence weighed like a shadow. The police gave no clear answers, and although it was confirmed that she had been kidnapped, they never found the body nor received a ransom call. We only knew she had been taken and never returned. It all started when Diego first dreamed about her. In that dream, she was in the middle of an endless highway, barefoot, with dirty clothes, standing next to a post that illuminated nothing. She just kept looking at Diego without speaking, with a look between pleading and lost. In the background, he could hear the screeching of birds, although it seemed to be night. Before waking up, Diego heard a whisper. "I'm not that far away, but I can't return either." Diego decided not to tell anyone. I repeat, we were all trying to move forward, but the next one to see her in a kind of dream was Faye. In her dream, she was in a house she didn't recognize. The walls were full of old photos from her childhood, but in each one, Luna appeared in the background, wearing the same clothes from the night of her disappearance. At the end of the dream, Luna sat in front of her and said, "If you go, don't go alone. He's still there." Leo, for his part, didn't dream about her or see her. Of all of us, perhaps he was the one who suffered the most. Luna and he always had a very close relationship, almost like boyfriend and girlfriend, but they never made it official or said so. When everything happened, he was the one who did the most to look for her. He tried by all means to obtain information, and even went to the area looking for her, threatening and shouting that he was going to kill whoever took her. I always thought that what Leo was really looking for was to die and reach her wherever she was. That day, Leo was in the living room of his house watching television and drinking some beers. He was already a little drunk when suddenly on the screen, a series of images with random moments from his adolescence were projected. Luna appeared in each shot looking at him directly from inside the screen, smiling at him as if trying to tell him not to worry about her. Leo knew that because of his condition, we weren't going to believe him. But when the visions of her walking through his house or sitting at the desk in the classroom became more frequent, he decided to end up talking to us. For my part, I only had one dream where she was looking for me to do homework. In my dream, nothing had happened to her. She kept going to school as if nothing had happened, but suddenly she said to me, "It smells a lot like cotton candy." And at that moment, she disappeared. Maybe it was guilt, or that we weren't letting go of that terrible moment. But it was strange how some of us could have this type of connection with her memory. The day we talked about it was on Brenda's birthday. Although not enough time had passed, the recommendation of our families even of the psychologists who treated us, told us that while it wasn't about forgetting what happened, we did have to continue with our lives as normally as possible, because otherwise the grief was going to cause us worse suffering, something like what was happening to Leo. That day there was no party, just a meeting at Brenda's house, since her mom had made her a cake and barbecue to celebrate her life. The lady invited us all with the intention that we would return to being those united friends of always, but not everyone went. Of the total classmates, only about 10 of us went. For a moment, all laughter and joy until Brenda went into the house to answer a call and came back in tears. She told us that while she was answering a call from an aunt, she felt like someone was hugging her. She thought it had been her mom, since she had been very affectionate all day. She just squeezed the arms of whoever was hugging her and finished her call. That's when she heard Luna's voice wishing her a happy birthday and telling her that she was waiting for the rains to be able to return. That afternoon, the celebration ended with everyone telling what we remembered about our friend, and also about the dreams and visions we had had with her. A couple of weeks later, they notified us from the district attorney's office that they had found some women's belongings, and that some were Luna's. They called us to testify if we remembered seeing any of those items that day. And in my case, I saw something I couldn't forget. Among the belts, makeup, rings, and women's shoes, there was something that wasn't Luna's, and that surely wasn't any other woman's. A kind of old and dirty hat. I had seen it before. It was the same one used by the limping man who had kissed Luna's hand outside the gas station. I immediately told the person who was asking us questions about that hat that I had seen it before and told him who wore it. They took me to a private room where I described everything I remembered about that subject. I told them that 2 other classmates who were outside had also seen him, but they told me no, that only I should tell them about that man. I described him just as I remembered, with his robust build, his height of no more than 5 feet 4 inches, his thick skin, his ashen hands, and that he was missing a leg. To walk, he did it with the help of a well-cared-for wooden cane, and he seemed to have a lot of agility despite his leg problem. They asked me if he carried any bag or accessory apart from the hat, but I didn't remember anything else, except that he had a silver tooth, like those that people used to put in when their teeth got cavities. Could it be the same one from Opelousas? Asked one of the agents. Well, at least it matches quite a bit. I asked them if they knew who it was, but they only told me that they had had a similar description of a man who had also seen the missing person hours before the kidnapping occurred. On that occasion, the man approached them while they stopped at a store in Opelousas. That place is a sugar-cane town where there's a sugar mill very close to the city of Lafayette, which was exactly in the same direction where they took our friend. Unofficially, the young man in charge of the investigation told me that it was about a gang, but not ordinary kidnappers. But rather they believed that behind those kidnappings there was something more, since there was almost never a ransom. Their victims were almost always women, and as cruel as it seemed or sounded, the bodies appeared under horrible circumstances, as if they wanted to erase evidence of something from their bodies. When I told my dad about this, he told me not to repeat it to just anyone, since those types of gangs have a lot of people everywhere, especially in Texas. That he, through his work as a truck driver, had heard many things about people who move around the borders of Texas Louisiana, and Arkansas. Some have to do with organized crime, others with human trafficking, some more with slightly darker things like witchcraft, sacrifices, and revenge. That information I decided to share only with 3 people: Brenda, Faye, and Diego. We decided not to tell Leo anything because of his depression, because he was pretty bad. He had stopped going to school and was already into other types of substances. According to him, when he was intoxicated like that was when he saw Luna. We weren't detectives or anything like that. We were just 4 high school students who wanted to know what had happened to our friend, and who, for reasons we didn't understand, had had contact with her through dreams or apparitions. So we decided to analyze all that. We came to the conclusion that she, or at least her body, had to be in that area, that she shouldn't be very far from where they kidnapped her, since in Diego's dream she told him, "I'm very close, but I can't return." And that area of Lafayette, the bayous, the sugarcane zone of Louisiana and Texas, isn't very far from here, at least in distance. She had also told me that it smelled sweet, the smell that sugar mills give off after harvest season. And she told Brenda that she was waiting for the rains to return, which we interpreted as water or a river. It's worth saying that there are many rivers in that area, but then we remembered what Luna told Faye. If you go, don't go alone. He's still there. I interpreted it as that man, the limping one, was still there marking women to be kidnapped. We insisted that the search should be more toward the Lafayette and Bayou area. We started using social media to look for her and focus the publications toward the Lafayette region, paying for Facebook ads. We didn't have a single piece of evidence, just hunches. We also made a post talking about the limping man so that people would be careful. We did everything from accounts we made each week so they wouldn't know our real names. Little by little, people from that area began to comment on the publications and tell stories similar to Luna's. The pressure grew to the point that some local media began to echo our publications, and that's when we received the news. Luna's body was found with 3 other bodies inside a car that had been set on fire, but the rain had extinguished it a few hours later. She had marks of torture, and her body was completely destroyed. Her feet were completely blown out, as if they had made her walk barefoot through horrible terrain. They had removed the 2 tattoos she had. They had completely shaved her head, and apparently her eyebrows too. She was wearing women's clothes, but it wasn't the same clothes she was wearing the day they took her. According to the forensics, they kept her alive for a while and then tortured her until she couldn't take it anymore. To get rid of the evidence, they tried to burn the car in a ditch, but the rain and the current that forms from the mountain made the fire go out and not finish its job. That vehicle was dragged by the current to a community in the state of Texas. That's when they notified the police. That's how finally, after some months, the rains returned our friend's body to Texas, just as she herself said in her dream. With the body home, and with the certainty that her family would no longer suffer, we tried to leave the matter in peace. We knew that the Louisiana authorities were never going to find those responsible, and that this country's bureaucracy doesn't help at all. Little by little, we recovered our tranquility, except Leo. He became obsessed with finding the culprits, and on one of his trips to the Lafayette area, he ended up killing a man who was missing a leg. Unfortunately for Leo, the limping man we saw was an undocumented immigrant who had lost his leg jumping from a train. Leo is serving 18 years in prison, in a Louisiana prison. In his mind, he already did justice, and that makes him calmer. But we know that limping man is still out there looking for victims. And God knows what they do with the people they pick up on the highways. But we're sure they're not ordinary kidnappers, at least not because of the way all their victims end up. We believe they're dedicated to something darker and more terrifying. Good evening, folks. Welcome to another special encounter. Before we begin, I want to know who's joining me tonight. Comment where you're watching from and what time it is over there. Well, let's go with the first story. Good evening, Dom. My name is Jake. I've never been much of a people person, but I also never liked being alone, or at least I thought so, until I opened my own business. I've had a food truck for about 5 years now, maybe a little more. It was the way I found to have my own corner, you know. A place where the rules are mine. The routine is almost a ritual. I arrive in the late afternoon, organize everything, fire up the grill, and the smell of fried onions doesn't take long to fill the air. It's a smell that means safety to me. My food truck is on a corner of one of those main avenues that connects downtown Austin with the outer neighborhoods. During the day, it's a nightmare of noise and traffic, but at night things change. The flow decreases, and the place takes on another face, more peaceful, more empty. My assistant Pete always says I like the early morning hours, because in them everyone is a little strange, so I feel at home. Maybe he's right. We serve people who get off work late, app drivers, security guards from the area, night people like us. That night business was slow. It was a Tuesday, if I'm not mistaken, one of those with heavy, sticky heat that clings to your skin. It was past 1 in the morning, and we were already thinking about closing. Pete was cleaning the stainless steel counter, while I flipped some burgers on the grill, more out of habit than necessity. It was in that silence broken only by the sizzle of grease that I saw him approaching. He came down the wide sidewalk, walking slowly, gliding. It wasn't the normal walk of someone in a hurry or tired. It was a slow, methodical pace, as if he had no fixed destination. He wore blue jeans and a dark t-shirt, simple, but something didn't add up. As he approached the light of the food truck, I noticed his face. He was a young man in his 20s, but with a pallor that our yellowish lighting couldn't disguise. The dark circles were deep, dark, as if he hadn't slept in days. He stopped in front of the counter and stared at the menu, but his eyes seemed to focus on nothing. They showed neither hunger nor doubt. It was an empty stare. "Good evening," I said, trying to break that strange atmosphere. He took a second to respond, as if my voice came from very far away. "A bacon cheeseburger, please, with everything." His voice was low, without any emotion. Pete stopped what he was doing and looked at me sideways, also feeling the strangeness. I prepared the burger in silence, handed it to him. He paid me with a crumpled bill and sat on one of the plastic benches we have in front of the business. He ate slowly. Each bite seemed calculated. He didn't look at his phone, didn't look at the street, just ate with his eyes fixed on an invisible point in front of him. That was making me nervous. I turned around to grab a rag and clean the grill. It was a matter of seconds. When I looked back, he was gone. The chair was in its place, the paper plate empty, but the guy had vanished. "Hey, where's the guy?" Pete asked with a furrowed brow. "I don't know, I didn't hear anything." And it was true. There was no sound of the chair dragging or footsteps walking away. He just left. His disappearance was as sudden as his arrival. We both stood there looking at the empty chair. The night seemed to become even quieter. We closed the business about 20 minutes later. In silence, Pete tried to make a joke, said the guy probably had to rush home to catch the late show, but his laugh came out forced. Neither of us believed it. The drive home was strange. I live in a 2-story house in a residential neighborhood not far from there, and I always take the same route. But that night, the streets seemed darker, the alleys deeper. I had the feeling of being watched the whole time. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, I only saw street lights and empty asphalt. I tried to convince myself it was just fatigue, the impression left by that bizarre incident. I didn't sleep well. I spent the time tossing and turning in bed, the image of that pale face returning every time I closed my eyes. It wasn't fear. Not yet. It was an uneasiness, a piece that didn't fit in my head. How can someone disappear like that? The next morning I woke up with a heavy body, as if I had run a marathon. I made a strong coffee and sat in the kitchen trying to shake off the bad feeling. I took my phone to check the news, a habit to start the day. I scrolled through the screen without much interest. Politics, sports, until a headline caught my attention. A local news portal. Fatal truck accident leaves 3 dead on North Austin Highway. I clicked out of curiosity. The text talked about a horrific collision, a truck with failed brakes that had crashed into a car. It happened around 10 at night. The report was long, with photos of the wreckage and the firefighters' work, a scene of chaos. At the end, there was a gallery with the faces of the victims. The first was an older man, the second a woman, and the third was him. I ran out of air. The phone almost fell from my hand. It was the same face, the same pale skin, the same sunken, lifeless eyes, even in the photo taken from some social network where he was trying to smile. The caption confirmed it. Nathan Rodriguez, 24 years old, Austin resident. I read and reread the news about 5 times. My brain refused to process it. The accident had been at 10 at night. I served him the burger after 1 in the morning, 3 hours after he was already dead. The coffee began to churn in my stomach. That hadn't been a strange person. It hadn't been a guy in a hurry. The person I served the night before was no longer alive. The certainty of that made a knot in my stomach, and the day that had barely begun already seemed like night to me. I didn't go to work that day. I called Pete and made up a fever, a headache, anything. I needed to be alone to try to put my thoughts in order, but the silence of the house only made everything worse. Every creak of the wood, every street noise made me jump. I spent the whole day on the internet reading and rereading the news, searching for the guy's profile. I found it. Nathan, 24 years old, photos with friends at a lake, hugging a dog. A normal life interrupted, and he was in my food truck. Going back to work the next night was one of the biggest efforts I've made in my life. The food truck, which had always been the place where I felt safe, now seemed foreign. It was no longer mine. Every shadow cast by the streetlights seemed to move differently. "Are you really okay, Jake? You look terrible," Pete asked while putting away the bread. "I'm fine, just tired," I lied, but I wasn't fine. Things started happening. Small things, almost imperceptible. A cold draft would pass down my back, even with the grill hot at full blast. I'd leave the spatula on one side of the counter, and when I went to grab it, it was on the other. Silly, I know. I could have moved it myself and forgotten. That's what I told myself. But the feeling was the worst. That constant impression of having someone right behind me, close enough to feel their presence. I'd turn around suddenly, heart beating faster, and there was no one, just Pete looking at me with a face that didn't understand anything. And that followed me home. My house, my refuge, now seemed as haunted as the corner. I was lying down, almost falling asleep, when I felt the air in the room change. It became heavy, dense. It was like feeling the pressure change before a storm. I'd open my eyes and stare at the darkness, trying to hear anything beyond my own accelerated breathing, waiting for something I didn't know what it was. My normal life was over. The situation dragged on for another week, maybe 10 days. Every night was a copy of the previous one. I'd go to work tense, spend the whole early morning looking over my shoulder, and return to a house that no longer seemed mine. I was exhausted, living on coffee and nerves. I barely ate, barely slept. Pete kept asking me what was wrong. He said I was going to end up having a heart attack. I just gave him excuses. How could I explain it? Hey, Pete, remember that weird customer? Well, he was dead. I'd be fired from my own business for being crazy. The last straw was on a Thursday. Business had been good, which distracted me a little. I got home around 3 in the morning, took a quick shower, and practically passed out in bed. For the first time in days, I really shut down, but it didn't last. I woke up to a click, a dry sound coming from downstairs. I opened my eyes in the complete darkness of the room. My first thought was a burglar. My body went rigid and I sharpened my hearing. Silence. Not a footstep, not a drawer opening. Nothing. It's just the house, I thought. Old houses make noises. I breathed deeply, trying to calm my racing heart. That's when I felt it again, the change in the air, that density, that pressure I already knew. And it was coming from inside the room. I slowly turned my head toward the door. The door was ajar, as I always left it. Against the dim light coming from the hallway, the shape of a person standing was outlined. I froze from head to toe. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't even draw air. My muscles simply wouldn't obey. I was lying down, exposed, and there was a man standing in my bedroom doorway. He stood there motionless for a long while. I could only stare with bulging eyes, waiting for a movement, an attack, anything. And then he took a step into the room without making the slightest sound. The wooden floor didn't creak. The air didn't move. He slid inside without making a single sound. The little street light coming through the window illuminated part of his face. It was him, Nathan, the same pallor that now in the darkness seemed almost luminous, the same sunken, empty eyes that were now fixed on me. There was no anger in his gaze, no threat, there was nothing. And that was the most terrifying thing. It was the gaze of something that doesn't belong to this world. My chest hurt from lack of air. My throat was dry, closed. I wanted to close my eyes, hide under the covers like a child, but I couldn't. I was a prisoner of that image. He took another silent step and stopped beside my bed. He was so close I could reach out and touch him. The idea gave me such an intense chill that a sound finally escaped my throat, a low, pathetic whimper. He didn't react, just stayed there looking at me. And then, as suddenly as he appeared in the doorway, his form began dissolving in the darkness. The air in the room returned to normal. The pressure was gone. I remained motionless for minutes, maybe an hour. When I could finally move, I sat up in bed in one jerk, gasping for air, shaking from head to toe. There was no longer any doubt. It wasn't my head, it wasn't fatigue, it was real. And he was inside my house. I could no longer deal with that alone. The next night, I could barely hold the spatula. My hands shook nonstop. Any customer who approached made me jump. I was at my limit, and Pete noticed. At the end of the shift, while we were cleaning everything, he cornered me. "Jake, enough. You're going to tell me right now what's happening. I'm your friend, man. You look like a scared animal." His voice was serious, worried, and I couldn't take it anymore. I broke down. I told him everything from the beginning. My voice came out rushed, I stammered, but I didn't stop. I talked about the guy, about the way he disappeared, about the news on the phone, about the things that moved, about the feeling of being watched, and about the night before. I described the silhouette in the door, his face beside my bed. When I finished, Pete was pale, looking at me with wide eyes. He opened his mouth to speak a couple of times, but nothing came out. I expected him to laugh, to call me crazy, but he saw the panic in my eyes. "Holy shit, man," he finally managed to say, running his hand through his hair. "I thought you were just stressed or something, but this. Do you think I'm going crazy, right?" I asked with a weak voice. "No," he answered firmly. "I don't think so. I was here. I saw when the guy disappeared, and I'm seeing your state now. We have to do something." That support was like taking a huge weight off my shoulders. For the first time, I wasn't alone in this. Pete became thoughtful. My grandmother, when strange things happened in the house, she always called a lady to do a cleansing. A certain Doña Iniacutes. She lives near here, in some little houses behind the main church. They say she knows about these things. I had never believed in that, but at that point, I was willing to try anything. The next day after lunch, we went there. The house was simple, with a low gate and a small front garden full of pots with herbs and other plants I didn't recognize. The smell of herbs was strong. A lady with white hair and a calm gaze opened the door for us. It was her. Doña Iniacutes had us come in and sit in the living room. While I told her the story again, she listened in silence, only nodding occasionally, as if she already knew everything. When I finished, she sighed a long, tired sigh. "That boy's spirit attached itself to you, my son," she said with a calm voice. "Sometimes it happens. A sudden death, a fright. The soul gets lost, not knowing where to go. He found you in a last moment of consciousness and clung to you like a life preserver." "But what does he want from me?" I asked, feeling a knot in my throat. "He doesn't want to hurt you. He's just confused, reliving his last moments. He needs help finding his way. You need to talk to him, show him that his journey here is over. You need to make him an offering." Doña Iniacutes gave us the instructions. They were simple. I had to go to the guy's grave, bring a white candle, a glass of water, and bread. The candle to light the way, the water to quench thirst, and the bread to feed the soul. A peace offering. She herself, through acquaintances, found out where he was buried in the city's main cemetery. Pete offered to accompany me. I don't know what I would have done without him. We arrived at the cemetery at sunset the next day. The sun was already low, tinting the sky orange and purple, and the shadows of the trees and graves stretched across the ground. The place had a heavy silence that no city has. We walked slowly through the cobblestone aisles, looking for the section and number that Doña Iniacutes had given us. My heart was beating so hard it seemed like it was going to burst out of my mouth. We found it. It was a simple gray granite grave with his name engraved in golden letters. Nathan Rodriguez, and the birth and death dates. Seeing that, his name engraved in stone, made everything concrete in a way that not even the news on the phone had achieved. I breathed deeply the cold air of the place, filling my lungs. I took the things out of the bag. Pete stayed a few steps back, giving me my space. I put the glass of water and the bread on the headstone. I lit the candle, protecting the flame from the wind with my trembling hands. The small yellow light danced on the stone. I didn't know what to say. The words I had rehearsed in my head disappeared. I stood there looking at his name, and that's when a memory came to mind with absurd clarity. A memory from the day of the accident, but from earlier, hours before. I was at the food truck. There was a small line and a guy approached the counter. He seemed agitated, distressed. It was Nathan. He looked at me, opened his mouth to speak, but another customer shouted his order, and I turned to serve him. When I looked back, the guy was already walking away with drooping shoulders. I didn't give it importance. He had been a face in the crowd who needed help. And at that moment, in front of his grave, I understood everything. Tears started running down my face, hot. "Forgive me," I said, and the word came out with all the weight I carried. "You came to ask for help, and I didn't see you. I was busy. Please forgive me. Now you can rest. You can go in peace. You don't need to be here anymore." While I spoke, the wind grew stronger, whistling between the headstones. The candle flame flickered violently, and with a last gust it went out. And at the same instant, the pressure in my chest disappeared. The weight I had carried on my shoulders for weeks, the feeling of being watched, everything dissipated. The air seemed to become lighter, cleaner. I knew with a certainty I had never felt in my life that he was gone. We stayed there until night fell completely. I was the one who broke the silence on the way back. I never saw Nathan again. Peace returned to my nights, and my food truck became my refuge again. But something in me changed forever. Today, when I see someone alone in the early morning with a lost look, I don't turn my face away. I stop, offer them a glass of water, ask if everything is okay. I learned the hard way that sometimes a minute of attention is the only offering a lost soul needs. Before moving on to the next story, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and have activated the bell to receive upcoming stories. I really appreciate your company, and your support makes all the difference. Well, let's continue. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.